I booked the Airbnb on a quiet street in a small town in Oregon, a place I thought would be perfect for a weekend getaway. The year was 2022, and I was 28 years old. I just needed to get away from the noise of the city, from my job, and from everything that felt overwhelming. The pictures on the listing showed a small, old house surrounded by tall trees, with a porch and a garden that looked peaceful and inviting. The price was reasonable, and the host's reviews seemed fine enough. I wasn't expecting anything special, just a calm place to rest and maybe write some. When I arrived just before sunset, the air was cool and crisp. The house stood alone on a narrow street with only a few other houses visible at a distance. It was a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint, but it had character. The porch light flickered weakly as I approached, and I noticed the front door had a sturdy old lock, but the key worked smoothly. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and wood polish, with the faintest hint of mildew in the air. I carried my bags in, setting them down in the small living room that was lit only by the last rays of daylight coming through the curtains. The furniture was simple but solid. An old couch with faded fabric, a wooden coffee table, and a bookshelf filled with dusty books. The kitchen was small, with basic appliances, but it looked functional. I opened a window to let some fresh air in because the house felt stuffy. I went upstairs to the bedroom I was renting. It was small but clean, with a bed covered in a thick quilt, a bedside table, and a lamp. The window looked out onto the backyard, where the trees cast long shadows in the fading light. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the bed for a moment, feeling tired but hopeful for a quiet night. After unpacking, I decided to explore the house a bit more. There was a bathroom next to the bedroom and another small room down the hall. That room had a desk and an old-fashioned radio that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't think much of it, but found it interesting how the house seemed to have been frozen in time. There was no Wi-Fi, which was supposed to be part of the charm, a digital detox. As night fell, I prepared a simple dinner in the kitchen. The only light came from a single bulb overhead that buzzed faintly. I ate quietly, feeling the silence of the house press in around me. It was peaceful, but also strange how isolated I felt. There were no sounds from neighbors or passing cars. Even the trees outside seemed still. After dinner, I sat on the porch with a flashlight, planning to read. That's when I first noticed it, a faint tapping sound coming from the backyard. At first, I thought it might be a branch hitting the house or an animal moving through the leaves. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. I stood up and looked out into the dark yard, shining the flashlight over the trees and bushes. Nothing moved. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was probably just my imagination or a small animal, and I went back inside. Later, I tried to get comfortable in bed. The house was so quiet that every small sound felt loud. The creaking of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge downstairs, even the soft rustling of the curtains. Then the tapping started again. This time, it seemed closer, coming from the wall next to the bed. It wasn't rhythmic anymore, just random, like a finger drumming nervously. I lay still, trying to listen carefully. After a few minutes, it stopped. I convinced myself to sleep. Around midnight, I woke up because the tapping had started again, now more urgent and louder. It was coming from the window side of the room, but when I looked out, there was nothing there. The yard was empty, the shadows thick and deep. I felt a chill creep down my spine. I decided to get up and check the rest of the house. As I walked down the stairs, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. Panic rose in my chest as I closed and locked it again, checking the bolt twice. Whoever had opened it must have done so without me noticing. I called the host's number, but there was no answer. My phone signal was weak here, barely enough for calls. I sat down on the couch, flashlight in hand, and tried to calm myself. The house felt bigger and more empty than before. At around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful steps. I froze, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then a long silence. I wanted to shout, to call for help, but my voice stuck in my throat. After what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away. I waited until dawn, sitting in the living room, watching the door, clutching the flashlight. When the sun finally rose, I saw tire tracks on the street and footprints in the dirt near the porch. I packed quickly, checking every window and door to make sure they were locked, then left immediately. I called the police once I reached a place with signal. The officers said they would come by to check the house, but warned me that places like that, in remote areas, sometimes attract people who think no one is watching. They suggested I be careful with any future bookings. I never went back to that Airbnb, and I never got any clear answers about what happened that night. No one else stayed there during that weekend, and the host didn't reply to my messages. The police found no evidence of forced entry, but the open door and the footprints told me otherwise. Looking back, I realized how naive I was to think a quiet, old house in the middle of nowhere would be safe just because it looked peaceful in pictures. Sometimes, the scariest things don't have explanations or endings. They just happen, and all you can do is get away and never look back. I booked the Airbnb late on a Friday night after a long week of work. I was exhausted and just wanted a quiet place to rest over the weekend, away from the noise of the city. The listing was in a small town in Vermont, a place I had never been before but thought it looked peaceful. The photos showed a simple, two-story house surrounded by trees, a porch with a swing, and large windows that let in lots of light. The price was right, and the reviews were decent enough, so I didn't think twice before confirming. I arrived just before sunset. The town was small, almost empty, with only a few cars on the road. The house was easy to find. It looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even nicer in person. The wood siding was a bit weathered but sturdy, and the porch had some old but comfortable-looking furniture. I pulled my suitcase up the steps and found the key taped under the flower pot by the front door, just like the host had explained in the message. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and old books. The floor creaked a little when I walked through the living room. It was cozy, with a worn couch, a small fireplace, and a bookshelf filled with what looked like local history books and some paperbacks. The kitchen was small but had everything I needed. I unpacked quickly, set my phone to charge, and opened the windows to let in some fresh air. The sun was disappearing behind the trees, and the house was getting darker. That night, I noticed something odd right away. The Wi-Fi signal was almost non-existent. My phone barely connected, and even then, it was painfully slow. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the rural location. I settled on the couch with a book I had brought, but after about an hour, the silence started to feel heavy. There was no sound from outside except the occasional rustling of leaves, but the stillness was almost unnatural. I told myself it was just me being tired and sensitive to the quiet. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I thought I had heard footsteps in the hallway. The house was supposed to be mine alone, and there was no way anyone else should be there. I froze for a moment, listening carefully. There it was again, soft and slow, coming from the direction of the stairs. My heart started beating faster. I grabbed my phone, trying to call 911, but the signal was too weak to make the call. The feeling of being trapped hit me hard. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, something the host had thoughtfully left, and slowly crept toward the hallway. The floorboards moaned under my weight as I moved, and I felt the cold air from the window brush against my arm. When I reached the stairs, the footsteps stopped. I held my breath and looked up into the darkness. There was no one there. I wanted to tell myself it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal outside making noise, but it didn't feel right. I went back to my room, locked the door, and sat on the bed with the flashlight pointed at the door. I tried to calm myself down, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing faint sounds. A creak here, a soft thud there, things falling or shifting. But when I went to check, nothing was out of place. My mind was racing. What if someone had a key? What if the host wasn't who they said they were? The next morning, I didn't sleep well. I tried to brush off the experience as paranoia, but I was still on edge. The house looked peaceful in the daylight. Sunlight spilled through the curtains, and birds chirped outside. I made coffee and sat on the porch, watching the trees sway in the breeze. The town seemed calm, and there was no sign of anyone suspicious nearby. I decided to explore a bit, hoping to clear my head. The host had left a paper with emergency contacts and local police station info. I called the station and asked if there had been any reports of break-ins or strange activity near the address. The officer on the phone said nothing recent had been reported, but advised me to stay cautious and keep the doors locked. That night, I stayed in the living room instead of my bedroom. I left the lights on and kept the flashlight close. I checked all the doors and windows multiple times. Around 2 a.m., I heard a loud bang coming from the back door. My heart jumped again. I grabbed a heavy lamp and slowly approached the door. Peering through the window, I saw nothing outside but shadows of trees. I opened the door carefully, flashlight shining into the backyard. The grass was wet with dew, and there was a trail of muddy footprints leading away from the door toward the woods behind the house. My stomach dropped. Someone had been there and they had tried to get in. I called the police, and they arrived quickly, their flashing lights cutting through the dark. They searched the property, but no one was found. The officers told me someone might have been watching the house for days and tried to scare me or worse. They recommended I leave immediately, saying it wasn't safe to stay. I packed my things in the early morning light, feeling a mix of relief and fear. I locked the doors behind me and didn't look back. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. I never went back to that town or used that Airbnb again. What scared me most wasn't the footsteps or the banging door, but the feeling that someone had been inside my space, watching me while I slept, and that I had been completely powerless to stop it. The silence of the house wasn't peaceful. It was a warning. Sometimes the most ordinary places hide the darkest dangers, and trust can be the most dangerous thing of all. I booked the Airbnb because it was cheap and close to the city, a perfect spot for a quick weekend getaway. The listing looked great online. An old brick house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Cleveland, 2022 summer. The photos showed a cozy interior, exposed wooden beams, vintage furniture, and a big backyard. It was exactly what I needed to get away from the noise of my small apartment downtown. I was 28, working a stressful office job, and the idea of a quiet weekend felt like a breath of fresh air. When I arrived, the street was surprisingly empty for a Saturday afternoon. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, shaded by overgrown trees. I grabbed my suitcase and walked up the cracked sidewalk. The front door looked a little worn, the paint chipped around the edges, but the windows gleamed clean. I fished my phone out and used the code the host had sent me to unlock the door. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and something faintly musty. Not unpleasant, just old. I dropped my bags in the living room and turned on the lights. The space was smaller than I imagined, but comfortable. There was a couch, a small kitchen with basic appliances, and a tiny dining table. The bedroom was at the back, and through the window I could see the overgrown backyard. I unpacked a few things and decided to explore the neighborhood before it got dark. There was a small convenience store 2 blocks away, so I grabbed some snacks and water. When I returned, the sky had started to turn gray heavy clouds gathering. I lit a candle on the dining table, the flickering light making the shadows dance against the walls. I sat on the couch with my laptop to watch a movie, but the Wi-Fi was slower than I expected. I tried to ignore it and focused on the movie. Around 9 p.m., I heard a faint noise outside, like someone walking through the yard. I looked out the window but saw nothing but the thick shadows between the trees. The house was supposed to be private, so it struck me as odd. I told myself it was probably an animal or maybe a neighbor passing by. Still, I locked the doors and windows and closed the curtains. Later, I went to bed early, hoping to rest. The mattress was surprisingly comfortable, the sheets a bit rough but clean. The only light came from a street lamp outside, casting a dull glow through the curtains. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard the noise again. This time, it was louder. Heavy footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. My heart raced. I pulled the blanket over my head and stayed still. The footsteps stopped. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a soft scraping against the door, like someone was trying to move the lock or push the door handle. My mind raced through every horror movie I'd ever seen, but I told myself to stay calm. I didn't have a phone with me in the bedroom, so I stayed quiet, hoping whoever it was would leave. Eventually, the noises stopped. I waited another half hour before I finally felt brave enough to get up. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. The porch light was still on, but the steps were empty. I locked the door again, triple-checked the windows, and tried to calm down. The next morning, I left the house as soon as I could. At the corner store, I asked a clerk about the neighborhood. She told me the house had been empty for months before I rented it and that some strange things had happened there. People hearing noises at night, doors opening and closing, things going missing. Nothing violent, but creepy enough that most locals avoided the place. I went back with a fresh eye, inspecting the house during daylight. I noticed the back door lock was loose, easy to open from the outside. There were faint footprints in the backyard dirt, small but human. Someone had clearly been there recently. The sliding window in the kitchen didn't close properly either. There was a gap barely noticeable, but enough for someone to slip a tool in. I reported everything to Airbnb and the police. The police said they'd check it out, but they didn't find anyone. The host responded by apologizing and offering a refund, but didn't explain how the place had been broken into or why the locks were faulty. I left the Airbnb for good, but the experience stayed with me. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural, just a bad, dangerous situation where someone had been sneaking around my rented house without my knowledge. The real fear was knowing how vulnerable I had been in a place that was supposed to be safe and private. Since then, I always double-check the locks and reviews before booking, and I never take cheap listings near empty neighborhoods without careful thought. The ending was clear for me. The house was an easy target for squatters or burglars because it was poorly maintained and off the beaten path. Someone had been entering while I slept, and it could have been worse. I got lucky. The fear came from the reality of how exposed I was, how the modern convenience of an Airbnb sometimes means trusting strangers with your safety. That's the real horror. I booked the Airbnb for a weekend getaway in a small town called Millfield, somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Oregon. It was September 2023. I was 29 then, needing to get away from the city noise and the constant buzz of work emails. The listing showed a quaint little cabin tucked into the woods, described as rustic charm with modern comforts. The pictures looked peaceful. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, large windows showing tall pine trees outside, and a small porch with 2 rocking chairs. It was the kind of place I imagined for a quiet weekend to read and relax. When I arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun was dipping behind the trees, and the air was already cool and damp with that fresh, earthy smell of the forest floor. The cabin was exactly like the pictures but felt smaller and older in real life. The wood looked a little more worn, and the porch floorboards creaked under my boots. The driveway was a rough gravel path, leading from a narrow dirt road that curved away into nothingness. No neighbors for miles, just woods all around. I unpacked my bags slowly. The inside was dim because the sun was fading, but there was an old-style oil lamp on a table that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I found some matches and lit it, and the cabin glowed with a warm, flickering light that softened the shadows. There was a small kitchen with a stove, a tiny fridge, and a sink with running water that sounded a little rusty when I turned it on. The bathroom was cramped, and the shower barely had enough water pressure to rinse shampoo out of my hair. I sat down in the only armchair, facing the fireplace. The cabin smelled of old wood and faintly of mold, but not enough to be unpleasant. I liked the silence, broken only by the occasional bird call or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Outside, the trees swayed, and the forest looked thick and dark. I was happy to be alone, no distractions. Night came quickly, and I lit a fire in the fireplace after finding some dry wood stacked near the back door. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and opened the book I brought. After a while, the silence around me felt too deep, like it was waiting for something. I shook it off and went to bed early. Around 2 a.m., I woke up because the cabin suddenly felt colder. I turned over and noticed a faint tapping sound coming from the front porch. At first, I thought it was just the wind hitting the door or maybe a branch brushing against the window. But the tapping kept coming, soft but steady, like something was lightly knocking or scratching. It wasn't a natural rhythm. It felt deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention without making a loud noise. I stayed perfectly still for a few minutes, trying to tell myself it was nothing. The cabin had creaks and groans. It was old wood settling. But then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, careful, but definitely footsteps. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The footsteps stopped near the porch, and I could hear the faint rustle of leaves. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and quietly unlocked it, but there was no signal, no service at all. The nearest cell tower was miles away, which I knew, but I hadn't thought about it until that moment. I tried again, but the screen only showed no service. The feeling of isolation hit me hard. The footsteps started again, moving slowly around the front of the cabin, like someone was walking in circles just out of sight. I peeked through the window, but all I could see was darkness and the blurry shapes of tree trunks. My heart pounded, and I realized the porch light outside wasn't working anymore. I had left it on earlier, but now the bulb was dark. I grabbed the small kitchen knife from the drawer. It was the only thing close by that could be used to defend myself, and sat frozen on the bed, listening. The tapping came back, this time louder, from the kitchen window. The window was old and had thick wooden frames, but the glass was thin. I held my breath. Suddenly, there was a sharp sound like a rock hitting glass. I didn't dare look right away. I waited, hoping it was just an animal. The tapping stopped, footsteps faded away, and everything was silent again. I checked the window and saw a small crack, as if something had been thrown against it. The crack wasn't big, but it was enough to let cold air in. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, too scared to sleep, but also too afraid to leave the bed. At dawn, I opened the door cautiously. The porch was empty except for some small footprints in the gravel. They weren't animal prints. They looked like someone's shoes, maybe boots, but there was no one around. The footprints circled the porch and disappeared into the trees. I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't want to call the police without any proof, and I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously. After all, it was just an old cabin in the woods. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't staying another night. I drove away slowly, eyes always on the road behind me, heart still racing. When I got to a gas station with signal, I called the Airbnb host to tell them what happened. The host said they would send someone to check the place immediately. Later, I found out from the host that some other guests had reported similar experiences. Strange noises, broken windows, and footprints around the cabin, but no one ever caught anyone or anything. No one knew who or what was responsible. I never went back to Millfield or stayed in a cabin like that again. That weekend was a harsh reminder that sometimes the scariest things don't need ghosts or monsters. Sometimes real fear comes from the unknown people around you, the ones who hide in the shadows and watch, waiting for you to be alone. And when you're out there, isolated in the woods with no one to call, you realize how vulnerable you really are. I had been planning this trip for months. After a rough year working long hours and dealing with stress, I finally booked a week away in a small town called Cedar Ridge, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. It was late October of 2023 when I arrived. The air crisp and the trees a riot of reds, oranges, and yellows. I wanted nothing more than peace, quiet, and a chance to disconnect. I found an Airbnb listing that looked perfect. A small, isolated cabin with good reviews and plenty of photos showing a cozy, rustic interior. The host's profile seemed straightforward, and I liked that the place was a bit out of the way, away from any town center. The listing said it was just 10 minutes from the nearest grocery store, but felt like the middle of nowhere. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my bags, got into my old sedan, and drove up the winding mountain roads until I reached the gravel driveway marked by a wooden sign, Willow Creek Cabin. Pulling up, I immediately noticed the silence. No traffic, no people, just the sound of wind through the trees and an occasional bird call. The cabin was exactly like the photos. A small wooden structure with a front porch, 2 rocking chairs, and a faded welcome mat. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. I locked my car and grabbed my bags, feeling a slight thrill that I was finally alone for the week. Inside, the cabin was warm, heated by a small electric stove. The kitchen was basic, with a stove, fridge, and a few dishes, and the living room had a worn couch and a small TV. I set my bags down and went to explore. There were 2 bedrooms, both neat but simple, and a bathroom with a shower. Everything was clean but showed signs of age. I opened the windows for fresh air and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows and bathing the woods in a golden light. That first night, I cooked some dinner and sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the trees move in the breeze. The silence was deep and calming. I even managed to sleep well, feeling comforted by the isolation. The next day, I planned to hike one of the trails nearby. I packed a backpack with water, snacks, and a map I found on the kitchen counter. The trailhead was about a mile down the road, so I started walking early in the morning. The path wound through dense woods, with leaves crunching under my boots and the occasional squirrel darting across. The air smelled like damp leaves and earth. I took my time, breathing deeply and feeling the tension in my shoulders ease with every step. By late afternoon, I was back at the cabin, tired but happy. I made some coffee and settled in with a book on the couch. The cabin felt like a safe bubble away from the world. On the 3rd night, things started to feel different. I was lying in bed reading when I heard a faint noise outside, something like footsteps on gravel. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. I stayed still and listened, but it stopped after a minute. I told myself it was nothing and tried to fall asleep. The next morning, I noticed something odd. The gate at the entrance to the driveway was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it the day before. It didn't seem like a big deal, but it made me uneasy. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, everything secure. Still, the feeling lingered. That afternoon, while making lunch, I heard the sound again, this time closer. footsteps crunching on gravel. I moved to the window and looked outside. Nothing. The driveway was empty, but I could see fresh footprints in the dirt, leading from the gate toward the cabin and then stopping abruptly near the porch. I felt my heart beat faster. Whoever had been there hadn't left yet. I locked all the doors and windows again and tried to focus on something else. Maybe it was just a curious neighbor or a local checking on the property. The host had mentioned neighbors were rare but sometimes came by. That evening, the power went out. The whole area, it seemed. The cabin's little stove and lights went dark, leaving me in near total blackness. I pulled out my phone, but the signal was weak, barely 1 bar. I turned on my flashlight and lit some candles from the kitchen drawer. The silence felt heavier in the dark. I kept thinking about the footprints and the noises. I sat close to the door, flashlight ready, trying to stay calm. Hours passed. Nothing else happened. Eventually, the power came back on, and I sighed with relief. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin for a while and drive down to the town to get groceries and maybe find a coffee shop. Before I left, I took a closer look around the porch and driveway. Near the gate, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small, crude pile of stones, arranged in a rough circle. I hadn't seen it before. It looked deliberate, like a marker. I took a picture with my phone and packed my bag quickly. The drive down the mountain was uneventful, and I bought what I needed. I told myself I was overthinking everything. Maybe the stones were left by kids playing in the woods or local hunters marking a spot. That night back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I double-checked every lock, moved a chair to block the door, and even kept my phone close by with the flashlight on. I stayed awake far later than usual, scanning the windows and listening for any sounds. Just before dawn, I heard something outside, slow, careful footsteps coming toward the cabin. I froze, barely breathing. The footsteps paused at the porch, and then I heard the faint scrape of something against the wooden floor. I grabbed my phone and aimed the flashlight toward the door, but the window blinds blocked most of the view. The footsteps retreated slowly, and after a while, silence returned. By morning, I was exhausted and scared. I packed everything quickly and decided I wasn't going to stay another night. I locked up and drove away from the cabin, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. As I passed the gate, I glanced back and saw the same pile of stones, still there, untouched. When I got back to town, I contacted Airbnb and reported what happened. The host was unreachable, and my messages were never answered. A local store clerk told me that the cabin's previous renters had complained about strange noises and things being moved, but no one ever found out who or what was behind it. I never went back to Cedar Ridge or that cabin. I still think about the footsteps and the stones. Clear signs someone had been watching, maybe waiting, or trying to send a message I didn't understand. I can't explain why someone would do that, but the whole experience reminded me how lonely places can hold dangers far worse than ghosts. Real people, real fear, and the feeling that sometimes being alone doesn't mean being safe. I booked the Airbnb in a small town in northern Vermont in the summer of 2021. The place looked perfect in the photos. An old, 2-story wooden house painted a faded blue with white trim. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat from my busy city life. The host's profile said the house was built in the early 1900s but had been renovated recently. I was excited to get away for a few days, hoping to relax, read, and maybe hike in the nearby woods. When I arrived late afternoon, the sun was just starting to dip behind the tall pines that surrounded the property. The air smelled fresh and damp from an earlier rain. The house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, isolated, with nothing but trees and a few other far-off houses visible. The front porch creaked under my steps as I pushed the old wooden door open. Inside, The house smelled like old wood mixed with a faint, musty odor, like a basement that wasn't quite dry. The floors were creaky but clean, and the furniture was a mix of antique pieces and some newer items. There was a small kitchen with basic appliances, a living room with a wood stove, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. The first night was quiet except for the normal sounds of the old house settling. The wind outside rustled the branches, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I had no phone signal, which was fine. I wanted to unplug anyway. I settled into the smaller bedroom upstairs, unpacked my bag, and got ready for bed. The window was cracked open just enough to let in a cool breeze. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. It was dark, but I thought I heard footsteps downstairs. The house had wooden floors and they creaked a lot, but these steps sounded deliberate, like someone was pacing slowly. I told myself it was probably just the house settling or an animal outside. Still, I stayed awake for a while, listening. The steps stopped. Then after a few minutes, I heard something heavy drop on the floor below. It wasn't a normal sound. It made me sit up, heart pounding. The next morning, I explored the house more carefully. The downstairs rooms were mostly empty besides some old chairs and a table with a few magazines. The kitchen was neat, but the fridge had an odd smell when I opened it. I didn't want to stay hungry, so I made coffee and some breakfast. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off. Later that day, I went for a walk in the woods behind the house. The trails were overgrown in parts, and I noticed a few old hunting traps set up along the path. It made me uneasy, but I figured people probably still hunted here sometimes. On my way back, I saw fresh tire tracks near the driveway, though no car was parked outside. The gravel was soft from the rain, so it was easy to see. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed the power flickered twice. The lights dimmed for just a second, but it was strange because the host had said there was reliable electricity. I checked my phone, it still had no signal. I thought about leaving the next day, but wasn't sure if I wanted to pack up in the dark. Later, when I sat down to read in the living room, I heard a faint tapping on the window. I looked up and saw nothing but thick trees and shadows. It might have been a branch swaying in the wind, but the sound was distinct, like a nail tapping on glass. I closed the curtains and tried to focus on my book, but my hands shook a little. That night, I locked all the doors before going to bed. I couldn't get comfortable, feeling like someone might be watching from outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard loud banging on the front door, 3 sharp hits in a row. I froze in bed, heart hammering. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. I didn't want to look outside, and I didn't want to call for help because there was no cell signal and no neighbors nearby. The next morning, I was tense. I looked outside and saw muddy footprints leading from the driveway around the side of the house. They were big and heavy, like someone wearing boots. I had not seen anyone the whole time. The prints stopped at the edge of the trees. I decided to pack up right away. I called a rideshare from the nearby town once I got to a spot with service. On the drive back, I kept replaying everything. The strange sounds, the footsteps, the banging on the door. I told myself it was probably just some local playing a prank or a hunter checking the house. But the thought didn't fully settle the unease inside me. Weeks later, I found out from a news article that a man had been arrested not far from that area. He had broken into several rural homes and had been stalking people staying in remote areas. The police said he would wait outside until night and sometimes try to scare people to get them to leave. The houses were easy targets because they were isolated and the people were usually alone. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. I didn't see the man, but the banging on the door was definitely him trying to scare me. The footprints confirmed someone had been around, and the dropping sound I heard at night was probably something he threw to distract or scare me. I had been too naive to think it was just an old house creaking. After that trip, I never stayed in a remote Airbnb again without checking security reviews and asking about neighbors nearby. The feeling of being watched, trapped, and completely alone in a strange place stayed with me long after I returned to the city. It taught me that sometimes the scariest things are real people with bad intentions, not ghosts or fantasy. That experience changed how I look at traveling and safety. I always double-check everything now, trust my gut, and avoid places that feel isolated without any way to get help quickly. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. And every time I hear about someone renting a remote cabin or house, I warn them to be careful, because the world has people who prey on others, and sometimes you only realize it when you're already inside the house. I booked the Airbnb on a whim, craving a weekend away from the chaos of city life. It was a small cottage in the outskirts of Ashland, Oregon, surrounded by thick woods, far from neighbors or noise. The listing showed a cozy, rustic home with old wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and big windows looking out onto a dense forest. The pictures were perfect. The reviews were good enough. I figured it was exactly what I needed to clear my head and write. I arrived just before sunset on a Friday in early October, 2023. The air was crisp, and the leaves were turning all the colors of fall: deep reds, oranges, and yellows. I pulled my car down the gravel driveway, parked near the house, and took in the silence. There wasn't a single car in sight. No other houses, no people. Just the cottage and the woods that stretched on endlessly. My phone signal was weak but still working. I had told a few close friends where I was, mostly so they'd know if I disappeared. The inside of the cottage smelled like wood smoke and something faintly musty, like it hadn't been lived in for a while. The furniture was simple but comfortable. An old leather armchair near the fireplace, a small kitchen with rusty pots, and a queen-sized bed covered with a thick quilt. I unpacked my bags and set my laptop on the kitchen table, ready to settle in for a weekend of writing and peace. Night came fast. I made myself a quick dinner and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The quiet was overwhelming at first. It felt like I was the only person left on Earth. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind kept wandering to the woods outside the window. It was so dark, the trees like black shadows. I told myself it was just nature and nothing more. Around 10 p.m., I decided to take a quick shower before bed. The water was lukewarm and the pipes creaked, but it worked fine. I noticed the power flickered once or twice, but the house was old, and I guess the wiring wasn't great. After drying off, I locked the door and closed the curtains, feeling a little safer inside the warm cottage. That's when I noticed it, a faint tapping on one of the windows facing the forest. I froze and stared. It wasn't heavy or loud, just light and slow, like something was trying to get my attention. I grabbed my phone to check the time. 10:15 p.m. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was probably a branch or a bird hitting the glass. I shook my head and went to bed, pulling the quilt up around my shoulders. But sleep was hard to come by. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to the sound again. The tapping wasn't consistent, but it happened often enough that I was wide awake by 2 a.m. I decided to get up and check outside. I pulled on my slippers and a jacket, grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and slowly opened the front door. The air was cold and smelled like damp earth. I swept the flashlight beam over the windows and the yard. Nothing. No branches moving, no animals. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. Feeling uneasy, I closed the door behind me and locked it. I tried to tell myself again it was nothing, but as I turned around, I saw the footprints. Clear, muddy prints leading from the edge of the forest right up to the side window near the kitchen. They were fresh, the mud still wet and soft. Whoever or whatever had been there had come closer than I thought. My heart started pounding. I checked the locks again, making sure everything was secured. I thought about calling someone, but the signal was spotty, and I didn't want to make a fuss if it was nothing. I returned to bed, but sleep was impossible now. By morning, the rain started. A slow drizzle that made the woods look even darker and more foreboding. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed up quickly and went out to my car. As I loaded my bags, I noticed something on the windshield. An old, crumpled note stuck under the wiper. My hands trembled as I pulled it off and unfolded it. It wasn't a message. It was just a single word, scratched into the paper with what looked like a pen but uneven, as if written by someone in a rush or nervous. The word was leave. I didn't argue with it. I started the car and pulled away from the gravel driveway, glancing back once to see the cottage standing quietly among the trees. The feeling of being watched didn't go away until I was miles down the highway, back toward the city and the noise. Looking back, I pieced together what must have happened. Someone had been near the cottage during the night. Maybe a local, maybe someone who didn't want visitors. The tapping was a warning or a way to scare me off. The footprints showed they got close enough to see inside. The note was a clear message. This was private, and I wasn't welcome. When I got home, I told the Airbnb host what happened, sending pictures of the footprints and the note. They were shocked and promised to look into it. I never stayed there again. The money was refunded, but the memory stuck with me. How alone and vulnerable I felt in that silent, isolated place. The scariest part wasn't just that someone was close enough to tap on my window or leave a note. It was knowing I had no way to protect myself, no real help nearby. Just me, a locked door, and the deep, dark woods outside. And someone watching, waiting. I don't blame the place itself. It was beautiful and quiet. But some places, no matter how peaceful they seem in the daylight, hide things you don't want to find out about at night. I'll never forget that weekend, and I won't ever take a remote Airbnb for granted again. I rented an Airbnb for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be simple. A small cabin in the woods, far from the city noise, a place where I could just relax and clear my head. The listing looked perfect. A cozy wooden house surrounded by tall trees, a fireplace, and a quiet lake nearby. The host's profile was friendly, and the reviews were mostly good, though a few mentioned the place being a bit isolated. That didn't bother me. I wanted isolation. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late September 2023. The air was crisp and cool, with leaves starting to turn orange and red. The cabin sat at the end of a long gravel road, miles away from the nearest town. The drive itself was peaceful but also a little unnerving. The forest around was dense, and as I got closer, the road got narrower and more uneven. When I pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Old but well kept, made of dark wood with a porch running along the front. There was a small fire pit just off to the side, and beyond that, the trees stretched thick and tall. I unlocked the door with the code the host had sent me and stepped inside. The inside was cozy and smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a couch and a fireplace, and a bedroom in the back. The windows were large and showed the forest outside, making me feel connected to nature even indoors. I set my bags down and started unpacking. The first night was quiet except for the normal sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional snap of twigs. I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled in with a book. But as the night deepened, I started to notice something odd. It was the silence that felt strange, not peaceful. In the city, there's always some background noise. Cars, people, distant music. Here it was too quiet. I'd hear a sound like a branch breaking outside and then nothing. No animals, no wind, no movement at all. Just silence, thick and heavy. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The The fireplace had died down, and the room was cold. I heard something outside the window. It was faint, but unmistakable footsteps crunching on the gravel. I froze. The gravel road was long and led only to the cabin. No other houses nearby. No cars parked outside. I looked through the window but saw nothing. The trees blocked the view beyond the edge of the yard. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the footsteps sounded too deliberate, too slow for an animal. I grabbed my phone to check the time and thought about calling the host or the police, but the signal was weak. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Every so often, the footsteps would come closer, pause, then move away. It went on like that for hours. The next morning, I decided to explore the area to shake off the unease. I walked down to the lake, which was beautiful but felt eerie without any other people around. I noticed fresh footprints on the muddy shore, human footprints, size about mine, leading away from the water and toward the forest. The air felt heavier, like something was wrong. I kept my phone close and tried to stay alert. When I returned to the cabin, I found something else unsettling. The front door, which I had locked carefully the night before, was slightly ajar. I never left it unlocked. My heart raced. I checked inside. Nothing seemed missing or out of place. I had left my backpack in the corner, and it was there, untouched. No signs of forced entry, no broken locks. I locked the door again and went around the cabin checking the windows. All locked. I spent the day trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe a strong wind pushed the door open. Maybe the footsteps were animals or just my mind playing tricks. That night, I did not sleep well. Around 11 p.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were not on the gravel road but closer, right outside the cabin. The sound of something scraping against the wooden walls, slow and soft, like someone running their hand along the boards. I was frozen with fear. I grabbed the biggest knife I had in the kitchen and sat near the door. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and careful, then stopped in front of the window beside me. I could hear breathing, not heavy, but steady, close. I did not move for what felt like an hour, holding my breath and waiting. Then, as suddenly as it started, the footsteps walked away into the darkness. The next morning, I packed everything quickly and left. On my way out, I stopped at a small convenience store in the nearest town to get a coffee. I asked the clerk about the cabin and the area. He looked at me strangely and told me a story. Apparently, the forest was known for a man who lived alone in the woods for years. Some locals said he liked to watch people who stayed in that cabin. No one had seen him much, but sometimes he would come near the road or the cabin, watching silently. The police had no solid proof he did anything illegal, but everyone was uneasy about him. The clerk advised me never to go back there, especially alone. I left without saying more. Driving away from the cabin, I felt relief growing stronger with every mile. The peaceful getaway had turned into a nightmare because I was never truly alone. I'm sharing this because I want to warn anyone who thinks renting isolated places is a good idea without knowing the area well. Isolation can be dangerous, not because of ghosts or fairy tales, but because there might be real people out there you don't know, watching, waiting, and ready to cross the line if you're careless. Since then, I've been careful about where I stay. I always research the neighborhood, read every review twice, and avoid places that feel too remote or have warnings in the reviews. That cabin taught me that real fear doesn't need ghosts, just real, living people with unknown intentions. I don't think I'll ever forget the silence, the footsteps, or the feeling of being watched. And I'm glad I left before it got worse. The cabin might be peaceful in pictures, but alone in the woods, it's a trap. And that weekend will always remind me of how real and close danger can be when you least expect it. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. It was late 2023, and I was craving a break from the city's noise and chaos. I found a small cabin listed just outside Asheville, North Carolina, a place I had never been but always wanted to explore. The listing looked perfect, quiet, isolated, surrounded by trees, with a small porch overlooking a clearing. The pictures showed a rustic but clean interior, and the price was right for a long weekend. I arrived late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. The road to the cabin was narrow and winding, cutting through dense woods. My phone lost signal about halfway there, but I didn't think much of it. The feeling of being offline was part of why I wanted to go. When I finally reached the cabin, it was exactly like the pictures. Wooden, weathered, with ivy crawling up one side. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I unlocked the door using the code the host had sent me a few hours earlier and stepped inside. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A wood stove stood in the corner, and the furniture was simple. A couch, a small kitchen table, a couple of chairs, and a bed in the back room. The floors creaked slightly underfoot, but everything seemed solid. I unpacked my bag and set down my laptop and phone on the table, already resigned to having no Wi-Fi or cell service. The first evening was peaceful. I built a small fire in the stove and settled on the couch with a book. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and I could hear the distant sound of a stream running. I ate some snacks I had brought and felt the weight of city life slipping away. As night fell, the silence grew deeper. It wasn't the comforting kind of quiet, but something heavier, like the woods were holding their breath. I lay in bed, listening to the natural sounds, telling myself it was normal. The first night passed uneventfully, and I drifted off. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I packed a small backpack and followed a trail the host had mentioned in his notes. The path wound through thick forest, uneven and littered with roots and stones. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing with a weathered wooden bench and a view of the valley below. The sun was bright, and the air was crisp. It felt good to be alone with nature. On the way back, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the mud, large and deep, not mine or any animal I recognized. They headed deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I paused, scanning the trees. Nothing seemed out of place, but I tucked the thought away. Back at the cabin, I made lunch and sat on the porch, watching the clouds roll over the hills. Then I decided to take a nap. I was tired from the hike and the quiet was soothing. The afternoon passed slowly. When I woke up, the sun was lower, casting long shadows through the windows. That's when the first strange thing happened. My phone, which had no service and no Wi-Fi, suddenly lit up with a text message. It was just a single word: leave. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. I checked the signal, still nothing. How could this message have arrived? I looked out the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. The forest was still and quiet again. I told myself it must be some kind of glitch, or maybe the message was sent before I lost signal, only arriving now. I tried to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. That night, I stayed up later than I wanted, sitting by the fire. I kept the door locked and the windows shut tight. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside. A slow crunching noise, like footsteps moving around the cabin. I froze, listening hard, but the sound stopped quickly. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. The next day, I planned to leave early, but when I went to open the door, the lock was jammed. I fiddled with it for several minutes, but it wouldn't budge. I looked around the porch and yard, hoping to find something that might help. Then I saw it. Deep scratches in the wooden railing, jagged and fresh. Panic started to rise. I tried my phone again, no signal, no new messages. I searched the cabin for anything else unusual and found a pair of muddy boots under the bed, too large to be mine. There was no sign anyone else should have been there. My heart raced. I moved to the windows and looked outside, but the woods were empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. I kept the fire going and sat near the door, ready to bolt if it opened. Hours passed. The scratches on the door increased, as if someone or something was trying to get in. I could hear heavy breathing, faint but close. I grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it tightly. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard the door unlock with a click. I jumped up, knife raised, but no one was there. The door swung open slowly in the wind. I ran outside, slammed it behind me, and locked it with a spare chain I found in a drawer. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window until dawn, watching the woods, knife in hand, nerves stretched thin. By morning, I decided to call the police. I found a spot a mile down the road where my phone finally had a signal. When I told them what happened, they said they would send someone, but it might take a while because the area was remote. I went back to the cabin, nervous but determined to wait. I started checking every window and door, reinforcing them with furniture where I could. I also searched the cabin more thoroughly and found a small notebook hidden under the floorboard in the bedroom. The notebook was filled with strange notes, dates, times, and scrawled words like watching, waiting, and soon. It looked like someone had been tracking the cabin for months. I shivered, realizing this was no random break-in or prank. Hours later, the police arrived. They searched the area but found no signs of anyone nearby. They took the notebook and boots as evidence and promised to increase patrols. I left the cabin that afternoon, shaken but relieved. I never found out who had been there or why. The host never responded to my messages afterward. I reported the Airbnb to the platform, and the listing was removed shortly after. The whole experience stuck with me for months. I kept thinking about the footsteps, the message, and the feeling of being watched. It was real, not a ghost story or some made-up horror tale, just a reminder that sometimes real danger hides in the quietest places, where no one expects it. I never went back to that part of the woods, and I never stayed at an isolated Airbnb again. It was late October 2023 when I decided to book an Airbnb for a weekend getaway. I'd been feeling burnt out from work for months, and all I wanted was a quiet place to unwind. The listing was in a small town just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. It was a 2-story house, old but charming, surrounded by thick woods. The photos showed a cozy interior, a fireplace, and a big porch that looked perfect for morning coffee. The price was right and the reviews were decent enough. I figured it would be a good change of pace. When I arrived just before dusk, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the road. The house looked exactly like the pictures, maybe a little more worn than expected, but still welcoming. The lockbox was easy to find, and I got inside without any trouble. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Damp wood mixed with a faint odor I couldn't place. It wasn't bad, just musty. The floors creaked slightly under my feet as I set my bags down and flicked on the lights. The house had an old heater that rattled when it kicked on, and I was glad I'd packed some warm clothes. The living room was small but comfortable, with a couch that looked like it had seen better days and a stack of old magazines on the coffee table. I went to the kitchen next. It was functional but clearly hadn't been updated in decades. Yellowing linoleum floors, outdated appliances, and a thin layer of dust on the counters. I opened the fridge. There was nothing inside except a half-empty bottle of water and a few expired condiments. I made a mental note to stop by the grocery store on my way back from hiking the next day. I set up the fireplace using the wood stacked neatly outside and got a fire going. The crackling flames made the place feel a little less gloomy. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the branches scrape against the windows. I liked that sound in a way. It reminded me I was somewhere far from the city noise. That first night, I slept with the windows slightly cracked open to let in the cool fall air. I woke up a couple of times hearing noises outside, but it was just the wind and maybe some wildlife. I told myself it was nothing to worry about. The next morning, I made some coffee and decided to go for a hike. The host had left a guidebook with some trails nearby, and I was eager to explore. The trail was beautiful, filled with golden leaves and the smell of pine. I walked for about 2 hours, feeling refreshed and calm. When I got back to the house, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I was sure I'd locked when I left, was slightly ajar. I froze for a moment, heart pounding. I'm not a paranoid person, but the thought of someone entering the house while I was gone hit me hard. I pushed the door open and looked inside. Nothing seemed out of place. The fire was still burning in the fireplace. The couch cushions were where I left them, and nothing was missing from the kitchen. Still, I double-checked all the locks and windows before deciding it was probably just a draft that had pushed the door open. I was still on edge, but I tried to brush it off and made myself a sandwich. That evening, I noticed that some of my phone's apps had trouble loading. The Wi-Fi was spotty, which was annoying but not unusual in a rural area. Around 10 p.m., just as I was getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps on the wooden porch outside. Slow, deliberate steps. I froze, listening carefully. The sound stopped after a moment, and there was silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. Still, I peered out the window but saw nothing in the dark. I locked every door and window again and pulled the curtains tight. I stayed awake for a while, checking my phone for messages or calls, but nothing unusual appeared. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I found something more unsettling. On the porch, right by the door, there was a small pile of dirt and leaves arranged in a circle. It looked deliberate, like someone had left it there on purpose. There were no footprints around it, just the marks where the leaves had been disturbed. My stomach tightened. I wanted to leave immediately, but I also didn't want to jump to conclusions. I decided to call the Airbnb host, but my phone kept losing signal. After several tries, I finally got through and left a voicemail explaining the situation and asking for advice. No response. That day, I stayed inside mostly, trying to ignore the uneasy feelings settling over me. Every noise outside made me jump. Every shadow in the house looked like it was moving. I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been watching me. Late that afternoon, I went out to check the basement. The house had a small cellar, and I thought maybe there was a fuse box or extra heater down there. The stairs creaked loudly as I descended. The basement was cold and smelled like mold. There were old tools and some boxes stacked in the corner. As I shone my phone's flashlight around, I noticed scratch marks on the wooden beams near the ceiling. They looked fresh, as if something had been clawing at them recently. My heart raced. I was sure I was alone, but the signs told a different story. I hurried back upstairs and locked the basement door behind me. That night, I packed my bags. I didn't want to stay another second in that house. Just before midnight, I left quietly, locking the door and dropping the key back in the lockbox. I drove back to town and checked into a small motel with a security guard at the front. I stayed there 2 nights before finally getting a flight home. Looking back, I think someone had been living or hiding in that house's basement or the surrounding woods. The open door, the footsteps, the strange pile of leaves. It was all a warning. The scratches in the basement confirmed it wasn't just in my head. I never found out who or what was there, but I'm certain it wasn't an accident or a prank. The experience left me shaken. I still use Airbnb, but now I check the reviews obsessively and look for signs that the place is secure. I don't want to end up somewhere like that again. Sometimes, I wonder if the host knew about it or if it was just a coincidence that I picked that house. But deep down, I know I was lucky to get out when I did. The clear lesson for me is this: Always trust your instincts and never ignore the small signs. If something feels off, it probably is. I learned the hard way that being cautious can save you from a situation that might turn dangerous. That weekend in Asheville wasn't the peaceful escape I'd hoped for. Instead, it became a reminder that some places hold secrets you can't see until you're right in the middle of them. And sometimes, the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but real people, real dangers lurking quietly in the dark. I booked the Airbnb on a whim, mostly because I needed a break from my city life. The place was advertised as a quiet cabin just outside a small town in Vermont. It was early autumn 2022, and the weather was starting to cool down. I figured the colorful leaves and fresh air would be a good change from the cramped apartment I'd been stuck in for months. The listing showed a charming, rustic wooden house nestled among tall pines, with big windows and a stone chimney. The photos looked peaceful and inviting. It was also cheaper than most places nearby, so I didn't hesitate. When I arrived late afternoon, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The narrow dirt road leading to the cabin was rough but passable. I pulled my suitcase through the gravel driveway and stepped out. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and damp earth. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but neat and well-maintained. There was a small porch with a swing, and the windows reflected the fading light. The door creaked a bit as I unlocked it with the code the host had sent earlier. Inside, the cabin felt cozy. The floorboards creaked gently beneath my feet. A wood stove sat in the corner, though it hadn't been lit yet. The furniture was simple but comfortable: a couch, a small kitchen table, a few chairs. A bookshelf had a handful of old paperbacks and a couple of board games. The kitchen had basic appliances, though nothing fancy. There was a bathroom with a shower and a bedroom with a large bed covered in a quilt. Everything smelled faintly of wood polish and something else I couldn't place. I unpacked my things and set my phone to charge. The internet was spotty, as the host had warned, but I didn't care much. I wanted to disconnect. Outside, the forest stretched thick and dark, and the last birds chirped their evening songs. I made a simple dinner on the stove, just some pasta and canned sauce, and sat by the window watching the sky darken. As night fell, the silence around the cabin became heavy. No cars passed by, no other lights glimmered in the distance. Just me and the woods. I read a book for a while, but eventually got tired and headed to bed early. That's when I first noticed it. Around midnight, I woke up because I heard a soft noise outside. It was hard to describe, like someone walking slowly on dry leaves or twigs. I froze, heart pounding. The cabin was supposed to be in a quiet area, miles from any neighbors or roads. I stayed still, listening carefully, but the noise stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer, maybe. I tried to get back to sleep, but the feeling didn't leave me. Every little sound outside sounded louder, sharper. The wind seemed to shift, making branches scrape against the windows. The next morning, I searched the perimeter. There were no footprints near the cabin, except some old animal tracks. Nothing unusual. I shrugged it off and went about my day, hiking a little and enjoying the fresh air. But that night, it happened again. The footsteps came back, louder and closer this time. I didn't hear them only once or twice. They circled the cabin. Sometimes they stopped, then started again. It was like whoever or whatever was outside was walking carefully, trying not to make too much noise but still pacing around. I checked the locks on all doors and windows. Everything was secure. I even shoved a chair under the doorknob just in case. My phone had a weak signal, but enough to call 911. I thought about doing it, but I wasn't sure if I'd sound crazy reporting footsteps with no one visible. Plus, the dispatcher might not take me seriously without proof. The third day was worse. In the afternoon, I found something unsettling. Near the back of the cabin, Hidden in the bushes, I spotted fresh footprints. They weren't animal tracks, too large and deep. They looked like someone had been walking barefoot or in soft shoes. The prints went around the cabin and disappeared into the woods. I took pictures with my phone but didn't dare follow them. That night, the footsteps returned, but now I heard something else too. A faint scraping noise, like claws or a sharp object dragging against the wood siding. It was slow, methodical, almost deliberate. I sat in the living room, heart racing, eyes darting toward every shadow. I turned on every light in the cabin. The bright bulbs made the darkness outside seem less threatening, but the sounds didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. Then, I heard the worst noise of all, a slow, soft tapping at the front door. My breath caught. The tapping was gentle, measured. Someone was outside, right at my door, waiting or trying to get my attention. I didn't move. I didn't want to open it or show any sign I was awake. The tapping went on for a minute, then stopped. I stayed up the whole night, clutching a heavy flashlight and a kitchen knife I found in a drawer. Every now and then, I peeked outside through the curtains. Nothing but trees and shadows. By morning, I was exhausted. I packed my things quickly, deciding not to wait until my planned checkout. I locked every door and window, then called a taxi from the weak phone signal. As I waited, I took one last look around. That's when I noticed it. A small scrap of paper wedged under the front door. I didn't want to touch it with my bare hands, but curiosity won. I grabbed it carefully with a pen. The note was typed, not handwritten. It said only, "Nice place. See you next time." I stood there frozen. Whoever had been outside had left me this message. Not a prank, not a mistake. Someone had been watching me the whole time, walking around the cabin, waiting at my door, leaving footprints and noises just to scare me. I don't know if it was someone local, someone who knew the area well. The forest was dense, making it easy to approach unseen. There was no one else nearby, no signs of other visitors. The host never mentioned anything about safety or warnings in the listing. After the taxi arrived, I left without looking back. I reported the note and the footprints to the local police. They said they checked the area but found no suspects or recent reports of break-ins. I never heard from the host again, and the listing eventually disappeared. That Airbnb trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. Not because of ghosts or fantasy, but because someone real, someone dangerous, had been lurking just outside the door. Now, whenever I travel or book places online, I check reviews carefully and trust my instincts more. That quiet cabin in Vermont taught me how close fear can be when you think you're alone, and that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you don't see, only hear, and the knowledge that someone was watching you without your knowing. I got out safe, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me for a long time, and I've never stayed in a remote Airbnb alone since. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. It was a small cabin on the outskirts of a town I'd never been to before, somewhere in the mountains of Oregon. The year was 2019, and I was 27, needing a break from the endless noise of the city and the stress of my office job. The photos online showed a cozy, rustic place with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a small porch overlooking dense forest. It seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, and away from everything. When I arrived late on a chilly autumn evening, the sun was just setting behind the hills. The road leading to the cabin was narrow, winding through tall pine trees that cast long shadows across the pavement. I remember feeling a little uneasy the moment I turned onto the gravel driveway. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, but somehow colder, less inviting. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood. The porch light flickered weakly as I approached the door. Inside, the cabin was dim but clean. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the walls had a faint scent of mustiness mixed with pine. The fireplace was empty but looked like it had been used recently. I dropped my bags on the floor and set about exploring the place. There was a small kitchen with basic appliances, a table with some mismatched chairs, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a window that looked out into the forest. I settled in quickly, unpacking a few things and lighting a small lamp. The heater was old and noisy but worked enough to take the chill off the room. I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee, looking out the window. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the sky had turned a deep shade of navy. Everything was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. That night, I slept fitfully. The thin walls let in sounds I wasn't used to: branches scraping against the roof, distant animal calls, and the soft hum of the heater. I woke several times, feeling like something was just outside the window, but I told myself it was nothing, just nerves or imagination. The next morning, I made a slow breakfast and planned to spend the day hiking nearby. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the back door, fresh but not human. They looked like large animal tracks, maybe a deer or something bigger. I didn't think much of it at first. As the day went on, I started to notice more odd things. The forest felt too quiet, almost like it was holding its breath. The usual bird songs were missing, and the wind was still. When I went back to the cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before I left, but maybe I was mistaken. I closed it firmly and checked all the windows, making sure everything was secure. That night, the unease returned, stronger this time. I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. I stayed still in bed, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just an animal or the wind. But the footsteps stopped right outside the window. I couldn't see anything, but I felt eyes on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The following morning, I found scratch marks on the porch railing, deep, long gouges, as if something large had tried to climb over it. I took pictures, trying to remind myself I was alone and safe, but inside, the fear was growing. I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains, and kept my phone close. Unfortunately, the signal was weak, and I couldn't get through to anyone. That afternoon, I decided to leave early. I packed quickly, trying not to panic. But as I stepped outside, I saw something that froze me in place. Scattered around the yard were dozens of small piles of sticks and rocks, arranged carefully in circles and lines. They looked like some sort of markers or warnings. I didn't want to stay and figure out what they meant. I hurried to my car, but the gravel driveway looked freshly disturbed. Tire marks that didn't match mine cut across the dirt, leading deep into the trees. I took a deep breath and started the engine. Just as I was about to pull away, I heard a low, guttural growl from the forest edge. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped down the driveway, not looking back. On the drive back to town, I tried to make sense of everything. The tracks, the scratches, the piles of sticks. It all felt like someone or something had been watching me. The whole place gave off a feeling of danger that wasn't from the wild animals or the cold. When I finally reached the main road, my phone got a signal, and I called the local sheriff's office. I told them everything I'd seen and asked if anyone else had reported strange activity near the cabin. They said no, but promised to send a deputy to check the place out. 2 days later, the deputy called me. He told me the cabin had been empty for months before I arrived, but when he went there, he found deep claw marks on the doorframe and the strange rock piles still arranged around the yard. He said it looked like some kind of animal territory marking or maybe a trespasser's warning system. I never went back. I changed my plans, canceled all future bookings in that area, and warned others not to stay at that cabin. I realized some places hold silent threats, not from ghosts or stories, but from something real and unpredictable. The experience stayed with me for years after. I kept wondering what had been out there, lurking just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. Whatever it was, it wasn't friendly. It didn't want visitors, and it made sure I understood that in the most basic, terrifying way possible. Without words, without ghosts, just raw, quiet menace in the middle of nowhere. So, if you ever find yourself booking a quiet cabin deep in the woods, remember my story. Sometimes the scariest things aren't made up. They are real, and they don't care about your comfort or safety. They just exist and they watch. I booked a small Airbnb in a quiet town outside Asheville, North Carolina, planning a solo weekend getaway to clear my head. The year was 2021, and after a long stretch of working from home in a cramped city apartment, I needed space, peace, and a break from all the noise. The listing looked perfect. A cozy cabin nestled in the woods, with a private driveway and promises of fresh air and starry nights. The host's profile was well reviewed, and everything seemed normal. I arrived just before sunset, the sky painted in soft pink and orange, the air cool and crisp. The cabin was smaller than I expected but charming. Its wooden exterior blended well with the towering pine trees surrounding it. A narrow gravel driveway led me from the main road through a winding path bordered by thick undergrowth and moss-covered rocks. As I parked, I noticed how silent the area was. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I grabbed my bags, unlocked the heavy wooden door with the code the host sent me earlier, and stepped inside. The interior was rustic but clean, with a faint smell of wood polish and a hint of something else I couldn't place. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a loft bedroom upstairs. Everything was modest but functional. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to settle in. The windows were large, letting in the last rays of daylight and giving me a clear view of the dense woods that stretched beyond the clearing. I made a quick dinner on the stove, ate quietly while watching the dimming light outside, and then lit a few candles to add warmth to the room. As night fell, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, looking up at the stars. The silence was heavy, almost thick. I felt a strange mix of calm and unease. It was too quiet. The woods felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, as if something was watching just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the nervousness of being alone in a new place. I went inside and locked the doors, double-checking the windows before heading upstairs. The loft was small but cozy, with a single bed pushed against the wall. The wooden beams overhead gave the room a cabin-like charm, but they also cast strange shadows under the moonlight filtering through the skylight. I lay down, pulling the blanket tight, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest outside. The creak of branches, a distant owl hoot, the occasional snap of twigs. I tried to focus on calming thoughts, but then I noticed something odd. The cabin's doorbell rang. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it rang again, clear and sharp. I sat up, heart pounding. I told myself no one could be there. The driveway was long and hidden by trees. Who would come here at night, unannounced? I didn't hear any footsteps outside, just the ringing. Then the doorbell stopped. I stayed awake for a long time after that, too tense to sleep. Every now and then, the doorbell rang once, faint and distant, like a whisper through the woods. I tried calling the host's number, but there was no answer. The Wi-Fi was weak, barely enough to send texts, no calls going through. I looked around for my phone's signal, but it was patchy. The next morning, I found some footprints near the porch. They were fresh but odd, bare feet, muddied, heading into the woods. I felt a prickling sensation of fear mixed with confusion. Why would someone be barefoot and wandering so close? I reported it to the host through a message, but still no reply. I tried to push the unease aside and explored the area around the cabin during the day. The forest was dense, with thick underbrush and old trees with twisted branches. I noticed that the woods were littered with signs of recent human presence. Discarded cans, some torn pieces of cloth caught on branches, and even small piles of stones arranged oddly. The deeper I went, the more I felt eyes on me. I always stopped and looked around, but there was never anyone in sight. That evening, the doorbell started ringing again, just as it had the night before. But this time, I also heard faint footsteps around the cabin, not heavy or fast, but slow and deliberate, circling the house. I locked every door and window and moved to the living room, blocking the main door with a heavy chair. I found a flashlight and my phone, keeping them close. Hours passed with no new sounds. Then suddenly, the power went out. The entire cabin was plunged into darkness. My heart jumped into my throat. I tried to calm myself, turning on the flashlight and checking all the locks again. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew someone had been here. The doorbell had rung multiple times, and the footprints outside were proof someone had approached, probably last night as well. In the early hours, I heard the sound of something scraping against the door, like nails or a tool slowly scratching wood. I didn't dare move, too scared to look out the window. The noise stopped after a while, but I couldn't sleep. I sat frozen until dawn. When daylight finally came, I went outside to inspect the door. The wood was scratched deeply in several places, as if someone had tried to force their way in but gave up. There was also a small pile of stones by the doorstep, arranged in a pattern I couldn't understand. I took photos and sent them to the host again, demanding an explanation or at least a call back. Nothing. I packed my things immediately. I didn't want to stay another night in that cabin. The isolation that had seemed peaceful at first was now terrifying. I left the key in the lockbox and drove away as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. On the way back to town, I stopped at a gas station and called the local police. I reported everything: the doorbell, the footprints, the scratches on the door, the host's silence. They took notes and promised to send an officer to check the cabin. The police found no one when they arrived, but they did discover evidence that someone had been living in the woods nearby. Makeshift shelters, more signs of occupation, even some stolen items from previous visitors. It wasn't a ghost or some fairy tale creature, just a real person hiding out, watching the cabin, and maybe waiting for the right moment. I never went back to that Airbnb. The host eventually responded with a vague apology and claimed ignorance about any problems, but I never trusted that place again. That weekend taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural. They're real people, hidden in the shadows, close enough to reach you but far enough to stay unseen. And when you're alone in the woods, even a quiet cabin can become a trap. I rented a small Airbnb in a quiet town in Oregon during the summer of 2019. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the city noise, a place to clear my head. I found this place online, a charming little cabin tucked away near a dense forest on the outskirts of a town called Willow Creek. The photos looked cozy, with rustic wooden walls and big windows that opened onto a wide porch. It seemed perfect for what I needed: quiet and isolation. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, driving down long, winding roads lined with tall pines and thick bushes. The sun was just starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the cabin as I pulled up. The air smelled fresh and earthy, the kind of smell you only get far from cities. I grabbed my bags and unlocked the front door with the code the owner had sent me earlier that day. Inside, the cabin was exactly like the pictures. Warm, with simple furniture made of pine, a small kitchen with basic appliances, and a living room with a stone fireplace. I set my bags down, opened the windows to let in the cool evening air, and decided to take a quick walk around the property. The backyard stretched into the forest, the edge marked by a rusty old wire fence that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. As I wandered, I noticed the silence was deep, almost unnatural. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just an eerie stillness that settled around the trees. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the late hour. I headed back to the cabin and made a small dinner, then sat by the window drinking a beer and watching the dark grow thicker outside. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing noises. At first, it was subtle, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. I thought maybe it was an animal or someone walking along the dirt road. The sounds came and went, never quite close, but never far enough away to feel comfortable. My phone had weak signal, so I couldn't call anyone or look anything up. Then I noticed something strange. The door to the backyard was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before going inside. My heart started to race. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the locks. Every door and window was secure except the back door. The lock looked forced, the latch bent slightly. Whoever had been here had tried to get in, or maybe they still were. I wanted to leave right then, but my car was parked outside, and the nearest town was a 15-minute drive. I didn't want to risk going out in the dark without knowing what was around. So I decided to stay inside, lock all the doors, and wait until morning. The night was long. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind brushing through the trees, a branch tapping the roof, the distant howl of a coyote. Around 2 a.m., I heard something banging against the back door. Not a gentle knock, but hard hits like someone trying to break in. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, flashlight ready. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started. But then, I heard something else. A slow scraping noise, like something being dragged across the porch. I shone the flashlight outside and saw a long piece of wood lying just beneath the door. It looked like a plank someone had used to try to pry the door open. Whoever had come was clearly trying to get in. I didn't sleep after that. I sat with my back against the wall, clutching the flashlight, eyes fixed on the door. The rest of the night passed in a blur of tense silence and sudden noises. When dawn finally broke, I felt exhausted but safe enough to go outside. The damage was clear. The back door had a huge dent near the lock, the paint scratched and chipped. On the porch, there were deep scratches in the wood, like claws or a tool dragged roughly. On the ground, I saw footprints in the soft dirt and a few scraps of torn fabric caught on the fence. I packed my bags quickly, locking every door behind me. I didn't want to wait for anyone to show up. As I drove away, I noticed a man standing by the side of the road a little way off, watching me. He wasn't the Airbnb owner. I had his number and had spoken to him earlier. This guy looked rough, with an old jacket and a cap pulled low over his eyes. When I looked directly at him, he turned and disappeared into the woods. Later, I found out from the local sheriff that the area had been experiencing a string of break-ins targeting isolated homes and cabins, often by people desperate for shelter or involved in petty crime. The Airbnb owner hadn't told me about it because he didn't want to scare off visitors. It seemed I had just narrowly avoided a serious situation. That weekend was a clear lesson. Even in places that seem peaceful and safe, danger can be closer than you think. I never stayed in that part of Oregon again, and I always check local crime reports before booking anywhere new now. Looking back, the scariest part wasn't the banging on the door or the scratches on the porch. It was the silence in the forest, the way it felt like something was watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I was lucky that time. Lucky the person didn't push harder or come inside. It left me with a deep respect for the unknown risks when you step outside the city and into the quiet. That cabin, the broken lock, the footprints, and the man in the woods all stayed with me for a long time. I still think about how close I was to being caught in a situation that could have ended very badly. And every time I look at an Airbnb listing now, I remember the stillness of that forest and the sharp sound of something trying to break in. I booked the Airbnb on a whim, needing a break from the noise of the city. It was late 2022, and I had just turned 28. The listing promised a cozy cabin in the woods of northern Oregon, far enough from towns to escape distractions, but still with reliable internet. The pictures showed a small, modern house with big windows, surrounded by thick pine trees and a dirt road leading up to it. The price was right, and the reviews were good, quiet, clean, great host. I didn't expect anything more than peace and quiet for a few days. I arrived on a cool autumn afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the towering trees. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Clean lines, wooden walls, and large windows facing the forest. There was a small porch with a rocking chair and a single hanging lantern by the door. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I pulled my suitcase up the short path and unlocked the door with the code the host had sent. Inside, it was surprisingly warm. A small wood stove stood in the corner, though I didn't think to light it. The place was spotless, white walls, a simple kitchen with a few appliances, a small living area with a couch and TV, and a bedroom with a queen bed. The windows were clean, and I could see the forest stretching out in every direction. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before nightfall. I made some coffee and sat on the porch, watching the trees sway with the wind. The quiet was thick and heavy, almost like the forest was holding its breath. I liked it. It was the kind of silence you don't find in the city, the kind that makes your own thoughts loud. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped fast. I went inside, locked the doors, and tried to relax. I played some music softly, read a bit on my laptop, and made dinner, just canned soup heated on the stove. The cabin felt safe, and I was alone but comfortable. Around 9 p.m., I noticed the power flicker once, then went out. I checked my phone, no signal, which I had expected in the woods. I found the flashlight app and went to the fuse box near the kitchen. Everything looked normal. I figured it was just a temporary outage and went back to the couch, pulling a blanket over me. The silence returned, now even thicker in the dark. Outside, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate, and close. I sat perfectly still, heart pounding. I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the sound didn't match. It was too heavy, too measured. I looked out the window into the blackness. The flashlight beam from my phone barely cut through the night. No movement. The footsteps stopped. Then something else. A soft scraping noise, like metal against wood, coming from the back of the cabin. I stood up, tense, flashlight in hand. The back door was locked, I was sure. Still, I moved toward it, every muscle ready to run. The scraping stopped as soon as I reached the door. I pressed my ear against the cold wood, but only heard the faint sound of the wind. I went back to the living room, trying to calm down. I checked the windows, they were all locked tight. My mind raced, imagining someone trying to get in, but the thought felt too unreal. The cabin was miles from the nearest road. Who would come here? Why? I sat back down, trying to ignore the noise, but the footsteps returned. This time closer, just outside the front door. I was frozen, flashlight still in hand. Suddenly, a heavy thud against the door made me jump. Not a gentle knock, but something hitting hard. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my only weapon, and moved toward the door. The thudding stopped. I stared through the peephole. Nothing. No sign of anyone. I spent the next hour in a shaky state, listening to occasional noises that didn't add up. A branch snapping too close, a low hum of a motor far away, the crunch of leaves. It was like someone was testing the boundaries, watching from the darkness. Around midnight, the power came back on, and the silence broke. I switched on every light, checked the locks again, and sat with my phone in my hand, waiting for dawn. Morning felt like a relief. I left the cabin to explore, trying to find signs of whoever or whatever had been there last night. The gravel road was empty. No footprints near the cabin, no tire tracks on the road. The forest floor was undisturbed. I started to question if I had imagined it. But when I returned to the cabin, I found something new. A small pile of stones stacked near the back door, neatly arranged like a marker. I took a picture and sent it to the host, asking if anyone else had reported anything strange. No reply. The rest of the day, I stayed near the cabin, never far from the door. At night, the noises returned. Footsteps, scraping, thudding. Each time, I waited until morning, checked for signs, and found none, except for those stones, which kept appearing in different spots around the cabin. By the third night, I was exhausted but too scared to sleep properly. I made sure the doors and windows were locked, the curtains drawn, lights on. I stayed awake, watching the shadows move through the trees outside, listening for the slightest noise. Then, just before dawn, I heard a different sound, voices low and muffled, coming from the woods. They weren't shouting, just murmuring, almost like a group of people talking quietly. It lasted a few minutes, then stopped. I grabbed my jacket and phone, deciding I had enough. I left the cabin without locking up, running down the dirt road until I reached the main highway. I called a taxi, and on the way back to town, I looked back at the dark forest. Later, I reported what happened to Airbnb. They told me the host had no record of others staying there recently and no complaints. I told them about the stones, the noises, the footsteps. They offered a refund and removed the listing. I never went back, and I never found out who or what was watching me those nights. The feeling of being watched, tested, maybe even hunted, stayed with me long after I left that cabin. It wasn't supernatural, no ghosts or monsters. It was something more real and more disturbing. Someone had been out there, close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to scare me without being seen. Maybe they were poachers or squatters, or someone who didn't want strangers in their woods. Whatever the reason, it was clear they didn't want me there, and I was the only one who knew. I booked the Airbnb on a whim, thinking it would be a nice break from the city noise. It was early autumn, 2019, and I wanted to spend a few days somewhere quiet, away from my usual routine. The listing was for a small house on the edge of a sleepy town called Millfield, tucked away in the hills about 2 hours from where I lived. The pictures looked peaceful. A rustic wooden cabin surrounded by tall trees, a little porch with a swing, and a gravel driveway that disappeared into the woods. The price was reasonable and the host had good reviews, so I didn't hesitate. When I arrived late afternoon, the sky was starting to turn that soft orange light, the kind that feels warm but hints at the cold night ahead. The place was exactly like the photos, maybe even better. The air smelled of pine and earth, and a gentle breeze moved the branches, making the leaves rustle quietly. The cabin was small but cozy, with a wood stove in the living room and simple furniture. There were 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a tiny kitchen. I unlocked the front door with the code the host sent me, stepped inside, and immediately felt a calm wash over me. After unpacking, I made a cup of tea and sat on the porch swing, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The only sounds were birds settling in for the night and the distant hum of a river. Felt like the perfect escape. But that night, something about the house made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The floorboards creaked a little, but nothing unusual for a wooden house in the woods. I checked the locks and windows twice before going to bed. I kept hearing small noises, a scratch here, a thump there, but they were so faint that I convinced myself it was just animals outside or the house settling. I told myself I was tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was barely up, and the air was sharp and cold. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was thick but not too wild, with a narrow trail that led down to a small creek. The ground was soft and damp from last night's rain, and I could hear water bubbling over rocks. I found a few wild mushrooms and some fallen leaves, but otherwise, it was just the quiet of nature. When I got back, I noticed the door to the basement was slightly ajar. The listing hadn't mentioned a basement, and I didn't remember seeing that door open when I arrived. I felt a flicker of doubt but pushed it aside. Maybe the cleaning crew had left it open by mistake. I closed it firmly and locked it. Still, a strange feeling crept up my spine. Throughout the day, I tried to keep busy. I read a book, cooked a simple meal, and took pictures of the landscape. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the window. A shadow, maybe, or the quick flicker of branches in the wind. I didn't see anyone else, and the nearest house was said to be a mile away. That evening, as I prepared to go to bed, the power suddenly went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the orange glow of the wood stove's embers. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but the battery was low. I lit some candles from the kitchen drawer and set them around the room. The flickering flames cast long, strange shadows on the walls. Felt different now, less cozy, more tense. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the basement door. My heart jumped. The door, which I had locked earlier, was now wide open. I stared at it, frozen. No wind could have opened that heavy wooden door. The footsteps stopped. I debated what to do. Calling the host wasn't an option. The cell signal was weak here. I thought about leaving right then, but my car was parked a short walk away, and I didn't want to stumble outside in the dark. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room. The candle flames flickered wildly. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, just in case, and slowly approached the basement door. My breath was shaky, and my mind raced through every possible explanation. Was it an animal? A thief? Someone hiding here? The last thing I expected was to find someone had been inside my rental. I peered down into the basement with my flashlight. The stairs were old and creaked under my weight. The basement was mostly empty except for some old furniture covered in dust and spider webs. But then I saw it. A set of muddy footprints leading away from the stairs and disappearing into the darkness. They were fresh. I followed them carefully, feeling the cold stone floor under my shoes. The footprints ended at a corner where the basement wall met the floor. I knelt down and noticed something odd. A loose board, just big enough to crawl under. My heart pounded as I realized someone had a hiding spot here. I backed up quickly and locked the basement door again. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone to check for service. A tiny signal appeared, and I immediately dialed the local police. While waiting for them, I sat in the living room, the knife still in my hand, eyes fixed on the basement door. I felt exposed and vulnerable, trapped in a place I thought was safe. The police arrived in about 30 minutes, shining flashlights and moving cautiously through the cabin. They searched the basement thoroughly and found no one, but they agreed the footprints were fresh and likely from someone who had been hiding down there. They told me this had happened before. Past guests had reported things missing, strange noises, and sometimes found signs that someone had been living in the basement without the host's knowledge. Apparently, the owner rented out the cabin but didn't check it carefully between stays. The officers explained that someone might have been sneaking in through a back entrance or even through the basement window, which was hidden behind thick bushes outside. The person could have been squatting there for weeks, using the basement as a shelter without anyone noticing. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked safely on the road, waiting for daylight. The police told me to find another place to stay, and I canceled the rest of my booking. Looking back, I realize how careless I was for trusting the listing blindly. The pictures never showed the basement door open or the overgrown bushes outside. The host never mentioned the basement at all. And I was lucky. This could have ended much worse. That experience taught me to always check every corner of a rental before settling in, to trust my instincts, and never ignore small signs that something isn't right. I still wonder how long that person had been hiding there, watching the house, waiting for the right moment. Maybe they just needed shelter, or maybe they had worse plans. I'll never know for sure. But one thing is clear. Sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or legends, but real people, lurking in the shadows where you least expect them. And when that happens, the quietest place on earth can suddenly feel like the most dangerous. I booked the Airbnb late on a Thursday night. It was a small cabin tucked away in a rural area outside Asheville, North Carolina. The year was 2023, and I had just turned 28. I was exhausted from the city noise and wanted to spend a quiet weekend alone, away from everything. The photos showed a cozy wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees, with a small porch and a fireplace inside. The price was reasonable, and the reviews said it was peaceful and clean. Perfect for what I needed. I arrived just before sunset. The narrow dirt road leading to the cabin was bumpy, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. As I got closer, the trees crowded in on both sides, blocking out most of the fading light. I parked my car next to the cabin, and for a moment I just sat there. The quiet was overwhelming. No cars, no voices, only the rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. The cabin looked just like the pictures, but in person it felt older. The wood was worn, the paint on the door chipped, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. I unlocked the door with the key left in a lockbox, and the smell of old wood mixed with faint mustiness hit me. It wasn't unpleasant, just aged. The inside was simple. A small living room with a couch, a few shelves with old books, a kitchen corner with basic utensils, and a bedroom with a thin mattress and blankets. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, but there was no firewood stacked anywhere I could see. I unpacked quickly and went outside to collect some firewood I had seen piled near a shed about 50 feet behind the cabin. The pile looked dry, but I noticed some of the logs were covered in moss, which made me hesitate. Still, I gathered enough wood for a fire and brought it inside. Lighting a fire in the stove wasn't easy. The chimney was clogged, and I had to blow into the flue several times before the smoke started to move upward. Soon, the cabin filled with a warm orange glow, and I felt a bit safer. Night came fast. The forest outside was pitch black, and the only light came from the flickering fire inside. I ate some snacks I had brought and decided to relax on the couch with a book. But the stillness in the air was heavy, like the silence was pressing on me. After a while, I heard a faint noise outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was more like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. They weren't far from the cabin. I froze, listening carefully. The steps stopped suddenly, then started again, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was weak, barely enough to send a message. I checked the door locks. They were fine. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some animal, but my heart was racing. Trying to ignore it, I went to the bedroom to sleep. The mattress was thin and uncomfortable, but I was too tired to care. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a soft tapping on the window next to the bed. I sat up quickly, heart pounding. The tapping stopped immediately. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and looked outside, but I couldn't see anyone or anything. I locked the window and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, feeling trapped. My phone buzzed faintly, a message from my sister asking if I arrived safely. I typed back quickly that I was fine, but didn't mention the noises. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking. I was sure I locked it. The cabin was pitch dark except for the embers in the stove. I got up slowly and grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter. Moving toward the door, I held my breath and shined the light around. Outside, the porch was empty, but the footprints in the dirt were clear, fresh, and heading toward the woods. They looked too big to be an animal's. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. I went back inside and checked every window and door again. I couldn't find any sign of forced entry, but the thought that someone had been outside, near the cabin, unsettled me deeply. My phone was dead, and I realized I had forgotten the charger in the car. I sat on the couch, eyes wide open, waiting for sunrise. The forest felt alive with sounds, branches snapping, twigs breaking, but no clear shape or figure appeared. At one point, I heard breathing outside, heavy and slow, then silence. I stayed frozen. Finally, the first light of dawn seeped through the curtains. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and decided to check the perimeter. The footprints from the night before were still visible in the soft dirt around the cabin. They led into the woods but did not return. That morning, I left the cabin immediately, driving back to the city without looking back. I called the Airbnb host as soon as I had signal. He apologized and explained that some locals sometimes wandered near the cabin, though he never expected them to come so close to guests. He said he would speak to the neighbors and check security. Even after I returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, waiting. The isolation that I thought would be peaceful had turned into something tense and unsafe. I decided I wouldn't book an Airbnb in a remote place again without checking for proper security and signs of recent activity around the property. The experience was a harsh reminder that the quiet of the woods hides many things. Not ghosts, but real people who sometimes don't belong there. The worst part was knowing I was alone and vulnerable in a place that promised escape but almost trapped me in fear. I keep the photo I took of the footprints on my phone. Every time I look at it, I remember that night. The way the silence pressed on me, how the cold crept under my skin, and how close I came to a danger I couldn't see, but could feel. From then on, I always choose places that feel safe, with clear signs of care and presence. Because sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what you imagine. It's the reality you don't expect at all. I booked the Airbnb on a last-minute trip to a small town in Oregon, somewhere far from the busy city life I was used to. It was early autumn in 2023, the air already cool and crisp, the kind of chill that makes you want to pull your jacket tighter around yourself. The listing was perfect. An old, two-story wooden house on the edge of the forest, with a porch that wrapped around two sides and big windows that looked out onto tall pine trees. The photos showed a cozy living room with a stone fireplace and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The price was right, and I was desperate for some peace, away from the endless noise and stress of my city job. The drive out there was longer than I expected, winding through narrow roads lined with trees whose leaves had started turning yellow and orange. I was excited when I finally pulled up to the house. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The house looked just like the photos, but somehow older and more worn. The wood was faded and splintered in places, the paint peeling off in wide strips. Still, I liked it. It had character. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, maybe old wood mixed with faint traces of damp. The floorboards creaked under my feet. I dropped my bags by the door and took a slow walk through the house, taking in the rooms. The living room was just as cozy as the pictures showed, but the fireplace was filled with cold ashes, and the windows had thick, dusty curtains drawn shut. The kitchen had old appliances, but they looked like they still worked. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms, each with beds made up in simple white sheets. The bathroom was small but clean. I unpacked slowly, enjoying the quiet. I spent some time lighting a few candles, even though the house had electricity. The flickering flames made the place feel warmer, less empty. Outside, the sun finally disappeared behind the trees, and the sky turned a deep blue. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the shadows lengthen, listening to the faint rustle of the wind in the branches. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As night fell, I decided to make some dinner. I found some canned soup and bread in the small pantry. The kitchen light flickered a bit when I turned it on, and the old refrigerator hummed loudly in the corner. While heating the soup, I noticed the silence around me. No cars, no dogs barking, no distant voices. Just the house and the forest. After eating, I went to the living room and tried to watch some shows on my laptop. The Wi-Fi was weak but working, barely enough to stream a couple of episodes. Halfway through, the power suddenly cut out. The room plunged into darkness except for the candles I had lit earlier. I checked the fuse box by the door and flipped the switch back on. The lights buzzed and flickered but stayed on. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just an old house with a shaky electrical system. Later, I heard a sound from upstairs, a soft thump like something heavy being dropped. I froze, trying to tell myself it was just the house settling or maybe an animal outside. But then I heard it again, a little louder, closer. My heart started racing. I grabbed my phone and flashlight and slowly climbed the stairs, every step creaking loudly. The hallway was dark except for my shaky beam of light. I checked both bedrooms. Nothing. The beds were untouched, the windows shut tight. The bathroom door was closed, but I pushed it open. Empty. I was about to go back downstairs when I noticed the closet door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. I didn't remember seeing it open before. I shone the flashlight inside. The small closet was filled with old coats and boxes. I stepped closer and heard another noise. This time, a soft scratching sound coming from the back. I reached in and moved a box aside. My hand brushed against something cold and hard. Pulled it out. It was an old metal key, rusty and heavy. I didn't know what it opened. I looked around the hallway again, but didn't see any locked doors. The front door and the back door were wide openable. The bedrooms had no locks. The only locked place I could think of was the basement. I remembered seeing a door under the stairs, closed tight and with a heavy lock on it. I had thought it was just storage. I went back downstairs and walked carefully to the basement door. It was a solid wooden door, worn but strong, with an old rusty lock hanging from the handle. I tried the key to fit. The lock clicked open with a heavy sound. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The basement was dark, colder than the rest of the house. I flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. I pulled out my phone's flashlight and looked inside. The stairs creaked under my weight. The basement was filled with boxes stacked against the walls, old furniture covered in sheets, and a faint smell of mold and earth. As I stepped deeper, I noticed the floor was uneven, and there was a faint dampness in the air. Then I saw it. At the far end of the basement, against the wall, was a door. A small metal door, not more than 3 feet high. It had no handle, just a heavy latch. I had never seen it before. My pulse quickened. What was behind that door? I moved closer, my flashlight beam shaking. The latch was old and stiff, but I managed to pull it open. The door swung inward with a screech, revealing a narrow, dark crawl space. It smelled worse here, like earth mixed with something rusty and sharp. I shone the light inside. The space was barely big enough to fit through, but I could see a pile of old, broken things. Pieces of wood, some old tools, and then something wrapped in a dirty tarp. I hesitated, then pulled back the tarp with shaking hands. Inside was a collection of strange items, old newspapers, a few photographs, and something that looked like an old, cracked phone with a smashed screen. The photos were yellowed and showed the house, but not as it looked now. In some pictures, the house was newer. In others, it looked abandoned. One photo showed a man standing on the porch, but his face was scratched out. Another photo was of a family I didn't recognize. Then I noticed something else, an envelope, sealed but brittle. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, written in neat handwriting. It talked about someone who had rented the house years ago and found things out of place. It mentioned noises, strange footsteps, and the feeling that someone was watching. The letter ended abruptly, saying the writer was leaving and never coming back. I felt a chill, but not because of ghosts or stories. It was because I realized something else. The house had been rented before, and whoever had stayed there had felt the same fear I did now. The noises, the locked basement, the hidden space. It all added up to a history someone wanted to keep secret. I closed the crawl space door, locked the basement again, and went back upstairs. I packed my bags quietly, my hands trembling. I didn't want to stay another night. As I left the house in the early morning light, the forest seemed less peaceful, more watchful. Later, when I returned home, I checked the local records online. The house had been empty for years before becoming an Airbnb. The previous tenants never stayed long, and some had left reviews mentioning weird noises and unexplained things. The man in the photos was the original owner, who disappeared decades ago under unclear circumstances. No ghosts, no fairy tales, just a real house with real secrets, hidden in the dark corners of its basement and its past. I never went back, and I don't think I ever will. Some places keep their history locked away for a reason, and sometimes it's better not to know everything. I had always liked the idea of renting Airbnbs when I traveled alone. It felt more personal and quiet than a hotel, and often cheaper. For my solo trip in the summer of 2023, I booked a small cottage in a quiet town just outside Asheville, North Carolina. The pictures showed a charming wooden house surrounded by tall trees, with a porch swing and flower boxes. It looked peaceful, the perfect getaway from the city noise and my stressful job. When I arrived late afternoon, the sky was already starting to gray with thick clouds. The air smelled fresh but damp from a recent rain. The road leading to the cottage was narrow and lined with overgrown bushes. It felt a little more isolated than I expected, but I told myself that was the whole point. I had my backpack and a few groceries, and the host had promised a lockbox with the key outside the front door. The house looked exactly like the photos, small, wooden, with a dark green paint and white trim. The porch swing creaked gently in the breeze. I found the lockbox tucked under a small ledge by the door, and after a few tries, I got the code right and opened it. The key was inside. I unlocked the door and stepped in. Inside, the cottage smelled like old wood and a faint trace of mothballs. The place was clean but clearly hadn't been updated in years. The furniture was simple. A worn couch, a small dining table, a tiny kitchen with a gas stove, and a small bedroom with a lumpy mattress. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering a little. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I put my things down and took a slow look around. The windows all had thick curtains, and I pulled them back to let in some light. The trees outside swayed heavily in the wind. I thought about lighting the fireplace, but the wood inside was damp, and I wasn't sure if the chimney was safe. As the evening crept in, the light outside faded quickly behind the heavy clouds. I made a simple dinner from canned beans and bread, using the gas stove, and settled on the couch. The silence was intense. No cars, no people, just the faint rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. I decided to take a quick shower, but when I turned the faucet, only cold water came out. I figured the hot water heater must be off or broken. Later, I grabbed my phone to check the Wi-Fi. The connection was weak, barely enough to load a few pages. I texted a friend to let her know I arrived safely. Then the power flickered and went out completely. I sighed. The storm must have knocked out the electricity. I found a flashlight in the kitchen drawer and lit a few candles I had brought. The flickering light made the shadows dance oddly on the walls. I sat down again, feeling a little uneasy. The silence was thick, but I told myself it was just the isolation. I decided to check the windows and doors to make sure they were locked tight. Everything seemed normal. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing noises outside. At first, it was just the wind shaking the trees. But then, faintly, I heard a scraping sound coming from the side of the house. It was slow and deliberate, like someone dragging a heavy object across the ground. My heart rate sped up. I held my flashlight tight and moved cautiously toward the window on the side. Outside, the night was too dark to see clearly, but I could just make out a shape moving near the bushes. It was too large to be an animal. The scraping noise stopped suddenly, and everything went quiet again. I blinked and looked closer, but the figure was gone. I told myself it must have been a fallen branch or maybe a deer brushing against the house. Still, I didn't like it. I checked all the doors again, locking them extra tight, and drew the curtains. I tried to calm down, sipping cold water and focusing on a book I brought, but my mind kept jumping back to that sound. Around midnight, the power came back on. I was relieved, but then I noticed my phone was dead. The battery dropped suddenly, and I had forgotten my charger back in the car. No phone, no way to call anyone if I needed help. I felt more vulnerable. I lay down on the bed, pulling the thin blanket over me. The wind outside had turned into a steady howl, shaking the house slightly. The trees scraped against the windows, making an eerie sound. I tried to fall asleep, but every little noise made me tense. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy footsteps. I froze. The front door was locked tight. Maybe an animal again? But the steps were measured like someone testing the floorboards. The porch creaked with each step. I didn't dare look outside. Instead, I grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter and stayed as quiet as possible. The footsteps moved slowly around the porch, then stopped. For a few minutes, nothing. Then a soft knock at the door. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just held the knife and waited. The knocking stopped. Then the footsteps retreated, going back the way they came. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the faint light creep under the curtains. When the sun finally rose, the noises stopped, and the wind calmed. I packed my things quickly and left, locking the door behind me. I called the local police as soon as I got reception and told them what happened. They said they would send someone to check the place. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They found footprints around the house, made by someone wearing boots. The bushes were trampled, and some windows had faint scratch marks on the outside. But there was no sign anyone had broken in. The police said it was likely someone living nearby was using the house to sneak around or hide out. Maybe a transient or a person with bad intentions. They told me to be more careful and to trust my instincts next time. The Airbnb host refunded my money and apologized for the inconvenience. I decided never to stay in such a remote place alone again, especially without better communication or security. Looking back, I realized how vulnerable I had been, trapped in that quiet house with no way to call for help, surrounded by unknown dangers. It wasn't a ghost or fairy tale. It was real fear from real people, and that made it all the worse. From that trip on, I chose Airbnbs in well-populated areas with good reviews about safety. I always checked for cell signal and made sure I had an escape plan. I learned that some places are quiet not because they are peaceful, but because no one is around to help if something goes wrong. That night in the cottage taught me the hard way that being alone in a strange place can be dangerous. Not because of fantasy, but because of people, the unpredictable, and the unknown. And sometimes, silence can be the loudest warning of all. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. It was the summer of 2023 when I decided to book an Airbnb in a small town called Cedar Ridge, nestled about 2 hours outside of Portland, Oregon. The place looked perfect in the pictures. A modern cabin surrounded by tall pine trees, far enough from the town to feel isolated, but close enough to run errands if I needed to. I was craving peace, away from my hectic city job and the constant noise of my apartment. When I arrived, it was early afternoon. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of overcast that makes everything feel a little heavier, and the air smelled like fresh rain and pine. The cabin was exactly as advertised. Wooden siding, large glass windows, and a small porch with a couple of chairs. It was quiet except for the faint hum of distant cars on the nearby highway and the occasional bird chirping. The road leading to the place was narrow and winding, mostly dirt and gravel, and the further I drove, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. I liked that. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly clean and modern. The floors were polished wood, and the kitchen had all the essentials: a fridge, a gas stove, and even a coffee maker. I unpacked my bags slowly, making sure everything was in order. The Wi-Fi signal was weak, which I actually welcomed because I wanted a break from constant notifications. I settled in with a book and a cup of coffee, enjoying the silence. As the afternoon slipped into evening, the wind picked up, and the tall trees around the cabin began to creak and sway. I could hear the branches scraping against the windows at times. The weather forecast had predicted rain, but nothing too heavy. Still, the cabin's large windows and thin walls made every sound feel amplified. There was a rhythm to it, a kind of natural symphony, but there was also something about the quiet that started to weigh on me. Around 8 p.m., I decided to make dinner. The kitchen light flickered a few times before settling. I shrugged it off as an electrical quirk. The cabin was old but refurbished, and I figured some wiring might be loose. After eating, I went outside to the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the trees bend in the wind. The sky was a dull slate color, and a few drops of rain had started to fall. I didn't mind. It was peaceful. That night, I slept with the window cracked open. The cool air mixed with the faint scent of pine was nice. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't thunder or the rain. It was more like footsteps. Soft, but definitely footsteps. I sat up and listened carefully. The footsteps seemed to be moving around outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, circling the house. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was heavier, like boots on dirt, not paws. I felt a knot in my stomach, but decided not to get up. Maybe it was my imagination. By morning, the rain had stopped, but a thick fog had settled over the forest around the cabin. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the gray mist swirl between the trees. That's when I noticed something odd. On the porch floor, there were muddy footprints, large, heavy prints like from a work boot. They led from the side of the cabin to the back, and then disappeared into the woods. I hadn't seen anyone or any vehicles when I arrived, and there was no way someone had been here without me noticing. My heart started pounding. I double-checked all the doors and windows. Every lock was secure. But how did those footprints get there? It was a question I couldn't answer. I grabbed my phone to call the Airbnb host, but the signal was almost gone. I sent a message and hoped for a quick reply. That day, I tried to distract myself. I went into town to get groceries, eat at a small cafe, and even stop by the library to pick up a novel. When I came back, the footprints were still on the porch, unchanged, even after a light rain. More strangely, I found fresh ones near the back window, a window that overlooked the dense forest. They looked newer, as if someone had been pacing just outside, watching. The unease was growing. I locked every door twice and shoved a chair under the back door handle. I kept a heavy flashlight and a kitchen knife by the bed. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. The cracking of branches, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. I was tense, on edge. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I packed my bags quickly, but as I was about to get into my car, I noticed something chilling. On the windshield of my rental car, someone had written in the fog, "You're not alone." The letters were messy, uneven, and fresh. I froze. There was no one around. No cars, no people. The road was empty. I didn't hesitate. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I thought I saw a figure standing near the tree line watching me, but when I blinked, it was gone. The whole drive back to town was tense. I kept the doors locked and the windows up, constantly scanning the sides of the road. Back in town, I contacted the Airbnb host multiple times. They claimed no one had been to the cabin recently and suggested maybe I was just stressed from being alone. But the footprints and the message on my car told a different story. I even called the local sheriff's office. They told me there had been a few reports of trespassing and stalking in the area over the past year, but nothing that was solved or caught. They advised me to report any further incidents immediately. I never went back to that cabin or Cedar Ridge. What scares me the most wasn't just that someone had been watching me or breaking into the area. It was that I had no way to prove it until it was almost too late. The silence, the isolation, and the sense that someone was always just outside, waiting. It changed how I think about renting places far away from everything. That weekend was supposed to be a peaceful escape. Instead, it was a real-life nightmare that reminded me how quickly safety can slip away when you're alone in the woods, in a place you think is yours, even if only for a short time. The footprints and the message were a warning, one I wish I had taken more seriously sooner. I had booked the Airbnb on a whim. It was a small, old house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The year was 2021. I was 28, traveling alone for a week to clear my head from the mess my life had become. The listing made it seem charming. A cozy little place with wooden floors, a small garden, and a promise of peaceful solitude. It was cheap, and I thought a week away from the city noise might help. I never imagined how wrong that choice would be. When I arrived in the late afternoon, the neighborhood looked peaceful. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows between the rows of aging houses. The Airbnb was a 2-story wooden house with faded blue paint, peeling slightly around the edges. The front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up, the screen door rattling in the soft breeze. The key was under the usual fake rock, just like the host had said in their message. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and something faintly musty. The floorboards creaked as I walked in, echoing in the silence. It was sparsely furnished, a threadbare couch, a small kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom upstairs. The windows were all closed, but the curtains were thin, letting in some light. The electricity worked, the water ran fine. Everything seemed normal. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in and start relaxing. I planned to spend the evening reading and maybe cooking something simple. After dinner, I sat on the couch with a book and a cup of tea. The quiet was intense. There were no cars, no distant voices, nothing but the occasional creak of the old house settling. It was almost too quiet, but I tried to ignore it. As night fell, the house felt colder than I expected. I turned on every heater, but the chill lingered. I told myself it was just the old wood and the wind outside. I went to bed early, hoping to get a full night's rest. The bedroom was small, with a thin mattress on an old frame, a dresser, and a single lamp. I closed the curtains tightly. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up. Something felt off. The silence was no longer peaceful. It felt heavy, oppressive. I lay still, listening. There was a faint noise, almost like scratching, coming from downstairs. It was too soft to be sure, but it was there. My heart started to race. I convinced myself it was just a rat or some small animal in the walls, common in old houses. I stayed awake for a while, straining to hear any other sounds. The scratching stopped after a few minutes, and I finally drifted back to sleep. When I woke again a few hours later, the house was freezing. The heaters were still on, but the cold seemed to have seeped through the walls. I wrapped myself in blankets and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. The next morning, I decided to explore the house more carefully. The kitchen was dusty in the corners, but the cabinets were stocked with some basic food supplies and dishes. The living room had some old magazines and a few dusty knickknacks on the shelves. I noticed something odd. The back door, which the host said was locked and unusable, was slightly ajar. I hadn't touched it since I got there. I closed it firmly and checked the lock. It worked fine. I shrugged it off as a mistake by the previous guest or the host. Still, it made me uneasy. I didn't want to call the host just yet. I figured it was nothing serious. That afternoon, I went out for a walk to clear my head. When I returned, the back door was wide open. My heart jumped. I closed it again, locked it tightly, and checked all the windows. They were all shut. I didn't see any footprints or signs that anyone had been inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been there. I tried to distract myself by cleaning a bit, but the atmosphere in the house was heavy. I kept hearing faint noises, footsteps on the floor above me, soft thuds, creaks in places where they didn't make sense. Every time I went to check, nothing was there. I tried to rationalize it as my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place. That night, I barely slept. The scratching came back, louder this time. It sounded like something dragging along the floorboards, moving slowly, coming closer to the stairs. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing myself not to move. The sound stopped suddenly. In the morning, I found fresh scratch marks on the hardwood floor near the stairs. They weren't there before. They looked deep, jagged, as if made by something sharp. My skin crawled. I cleaned them up, hoping to get rid of the marks, but they reappeared overnight. At this point, I was ready to leave. I packed hastily, locking the house behind me. Before I left, I checked the back garden and the small shed out back. The shed door was locked, but I saw footprints leading from the shed to the back door, which explained how the door had been opened. Whoever had been coming in had access to the shed. I called the Airbnb host from the car. They claimed no one else had a key and that the shed was empty and locked. I told them about the scratches and the open door, but they dismissed it as probably a mistake or me imagining things. I didn't argue. I just drove away. When I got home, I checked the reviews for that Airbnb again. One recent reviewer mentioned strange noises and feeling watched, but the comment was vague. The host had responded, saying they'd never had problems and guests should feel safe. I reported the situation to Airbnb, describing the open door, scratches, and strange noises. They refunded my money but said they couldn't investigate further without proof. Looking back, I realized how vulnerable I had been in that house. Someone had been getting in without my knowledge. The open door and the footprints meant the place wasn't secure. The scratching was likely caused by that person or an animal they kept in the shed. The coldness I felt might have been drafts from the open door or the house's age, but the feeling of being watched wasn't just in my head. I learned to trust my instincts, The charm of a cheap, quiet getaway wasn't worth risking my safety. That Airbnb was never truly safe, and I was lucky to get out without anything worse happening. I never stayed in an old house on the edge of nowhere again without checking every lock, every door, and trusting any small warning my gut gave me. Sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes it's the sound of something waiting. I booked the Airbnb on a whim, looking for a quiet weekend away from the noise of the city. The listing was perfect, an old, restored farmhouse nestled in the woods just outside a small town in Vermont. The year was 2018, and I was 28, hoping for a little peace and quiet, a break from my usual routine of screens and deadlines. The pictures showed a warm, rustic place with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and large windows that looked out onto tall pines. It seemed like the kind of place where I could just breathe. When I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The house looked exactly like the photos, but somehow more isolated in person. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. I unlocked the door with the code the host had texted me earlier and stepped inside. The floor creaked under my boots, and the smell of old wood mixed with faint traces of something else. Maybe smoke or something I couldn't quite place. The house was dusty but tidy, like it hadn't been used for a while. I set down my bag and started exploring. The living room had a heavy wooden table, a couch covered in thick fabric, and the stone fireplace stacked with firewood. On the kitchen counter, there was a small stack of fire-starting materials, some canned goods, and a jar of homemade jam left for guests. I decided to make a fire and settle in. As the flames crackled and the room grew warmer, the house started to feel less empty, but something still felt off. The windows were dirty, and through them, the forest looked dark and dense, almost like it was pressing in on the house. I turned on every light I could find, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling. Around 9 p.m., I went to the bedroom upstairs. The bed was old but clean, with thick blankets folded at the foot. I checked the bathroom, basic but functional, and then got ready for bed. Before sleeping, I glanced out the window. The moon was barely visible behind thick clouds, and the forest looked endless. That night, I was woken by the sound of something scratching at the back door. It was a faint noise at first, like nails on wood, slow and deliberate. My heart started racing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog, but the sound repeated and it didn't stop for a long time. I stayed still, listening carefully, but I couldn't see anything through the frosted glass of the door. The next morning, I went outside to check for damage or signs of what could have caused the noise. There were no footprints or markings near the door, but I noticed the back porch light was broken. The bulb was shattered on the ground. I had no idea when that happened. I tried to push the feeling away and spent the day hiking the trails nearby. The woods were beautiful but dense, and I realized quickly how isolated I was. The nearest town was over 10 miles away, with no cell service in the area. I hadn't thought about that when I booked. When I returned to the house that evening, the sun was setting quickly, and the shadows were long. As I walked up the porch, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. My stomach sank. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, scanning every corner. Nothing was missing, nothing looked out of place, but the air inside felt heavier. The smell that had been faint before was stronger now, like something stale and old. I locked every door and window and sat near the fireplace, trying to calm down. The house was silent except for the wind rattling the trees outside. I looked at my phone, still no signal. I tried the landline, but there was no dial tone. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I was awakened by a loud banging coming from the basement. The house didn't have a finished basement, just a small cellar for storage. I debated going down to check, but was too scared. Instead, I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and tried to focus on what I could do next. My car was parked outside, but the idea of stepping outside in the middle of the night, surrounded by forest and who knows what else, made me freeze. I waited, heart pounding, but the noise stopped after a few minutes. In the morning, I found the basement door wide open. I was certain I had locked it. The basement was dark and dusty, filled with old tools and boxes covered in cobwebs. Nothing was disturbed except a small pile of dirt on the floor that looked freshly kicked up. I shone my flashlight around, but found nothing else. The house felt suffocating now. The isolation wasn't peaceful, it was trapping me. I checked the windows again and saw faint footprints outside that led away from the house and disappeared into the woods. The prints were too big to be a small animal. They looked human. I spent the day packing. I wanted to leave immediately, but my car's battery was dead. I remembered I had a jumper cable in the trunk and hoped the neighbors were close enough to help. But there were no neighbors, only forest for miles. The closest help was a good half-hour drive back down the dirt road. The feeling that someone or something had been in the house with me was unbearable. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every noise made me jump. I could almost feel eyes watching me from the trees. Late that afternoon, I finally got the car started. As I drove away, I looked back at the house. In the fading light, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just out of the clearing where the house stood. It didn't move as I passed, just stood there watching. I didn't look back after that. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, called a friend, and stayed with them for the night. In the days after, I reported what happened to Airbnb. They told me they would investigate, but I never got a clear explanation. The host didn't respond to messages, and the listing was removed shortly after. I never found out who that figure was or why the house felt so wrong. The worst part was knowing someone had been inside the house with me, someone who didn't want to be seen or caught. Even now, years later, I still think about that weekend. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. The peace I sought in the woods turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. The house was just a shell, but something dark lived there. Not ghosts or stories, just real fear. The kind that creeps in when you realize you're not alone, and no one is coming to save you. I booked the Airbnb for a quiet weekend getaway, something away from the noise of the city. The place was a small two-story house on the edge of a quiet suburb in Oregon. It was 2023, and I was 29 at the time, looking forward to some peace and a bit of time to myself. The photos on the listing showed a cozy-looking house with a small garden and big windows that let in a lot of light. The price was right, and the reviews were decent, so I didn't hesitate. When I arrived just before sunset, the street was almost empty. The houses nearby were spaced apart, with trees lining the sidewalks. The air smelled fresh but cool, carrying that faint scent of wet earth from the recent rain. The house itself was a little older, maybe built in the 80s or 90s, with white paint that was starting to peel in places and a wooden porch that creaked under my feet as I stepped up. The front door had a keypad lock, which I had the code for in the booking confirmation. After punching it in, the door clicked open. Inside, the place was dim but clean. The floors were wooden, and the furniture was simple but comfortable. A living room with a couch, a small TV, and a bookshelf filled with old books and magazines. To the right was the kitchen, which looked functional enough, with a coffee maker, stove, and fridge stocked with some basics. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom. I dropped my bags and started to unpack slowly. The first few hours went by without anything unusual. I made myself some tea, sat on the couch, and looked out the window. Outside, the sky was turning dark, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. The quiet was calming, but also a little too quiet. No cars passed, no people walked by, just the occasional sound of wind rustling leaves. As night fell, I started to feel a slight unease. It was nothing specific, just a creeping sensation like something wasn't right. I checked my phone to tell a friend I had arrived safely, but the signal was weak and the Wi-Fi in the house was spotty at best. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the remote location. Before going to bed, I did a quick walk through the house. Everything seemed normal, but then I noticed something odd near the back door. On the floor, there was a faint set of muddy footprints leading from the door into the kitchen. I was alone, and the door was locked. I wiped them off quickly, thinking maybe the cleaner had missed them, or maybe the previous guest. I went upstairs and settled into the bigger bedroom. The bed was firm but comfortable. I kept the light on for a while, scrolling through my phone despite the poor signal, then eventually turned it off and tried to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. The house was silent except for a faint creaking sound coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, old wood moving as it cooled in the night. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate noise like footsteps on the wooden floor. My heart raced. I lay still, listening carefully. The sound stopped after a few seconds, then started again near the stairs. I didn't want to believe someone had broken in, but the locked front and back doors didn't make sense if it were just me. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the police, but the signal was gone. The Wi-Fi had dropped completely. I felt trapped. I stayed in the bedroom, eyes wide open, listening for any more sounds. After about 20 minutes, everything fell silent again. I debated whether to go downstairs or stay put. The logical side of me knew it could be animals or the house itself, but the footprints I had seen earlier kept playing in my mind. At dawn, I finally got some signal back and called a friend to tell them what was happening. I described the footprints and the noises. They suggested I leave immediately and call the police once I was safe. I packed my things quickly and headed downstairs. The house looked exactly the same as the night before, except for one thing. The back door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. My hands shook as I pushed it open fully. Outside, the backyard was empty, no signs of anyone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around the quiet street. No cars, no people, just the cold morning air. I decided not to wait around. I got in my car and locked the doors behind me. Before driving off, I called the local police and reported the situation. They told me they would send an officer to check the house. A few days later, the police called me back with an update. They had searched the house and found no one inside. No signs of forced entry either, except for the back door, which was unlocked but not broken. They said sometimes older locks don't secure properly, and the footprints might have been from an animal or from someone who had access before me, like a cleaner or maintenance person. But nothing concrete. Still, something didn't sit right with me. The whole experience was too strange, too real to be a coincidence or just old house noises. I realized I had narrowly escaped a situation that could have been dangerous. I never stayed in another Airbnb alone after that. The peace I was seeking turned into a constant worry, a reminder that sometimes the quietest places hide the most unsettling secrets. The house, the footprints, the sounds, they all left a mark on me, a memory that I can't shake. It was a clear lesson that not all escapes from the city are safe, and sometimes the safest place is just to go home. I arrived at the Airbnb late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the tall trees lining the narrow road. The house was on the edge of a small, quiet town in Vermont, somewhere far from the usual tourist spots. I had picked this place because it looked charming online, An old farmhouse with white paint peeling at the edges and a wraparound porch that promised peaceful evenings. It was 2023, and I was 27, needing a break from the constant noise of city life and endless emails. The moment I pulled up, the place felt off. It wasn't exactly the house itself. It was the silence around it. No cars passed, no dogs barked, no distant voices. Just the wind moving through the dry leaves on the ground. I shook it off and grabbed my bags, locking my car behind me. The front door was old but not hard to open. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my boots, and the smell hit me first. A strong scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. I thought maybe the place hadn't been aired out in a while. Inside, the house was dim. Thick curtains covered most windows, and the lights flickered when I tried to turn them on. The walls were yellowed, and the furniture looked like it had been there for decades, covered in sheets and dust. The air felt heavy, like the house was holding its breath. I dropped my bags on the floor and pulled back the curtains in the living room. The light flooded in, but the view outside was just dense forest and shadows stretching across the yard. I moved through the house, trying to get comfortable. The kitchen was outdated, with rusty taps and a fridge that hummed loudly but seemed clean inside. The bedroom upstairs was small but cozy enough. I set my phone on the nightstand, checked the Wi-Fi. It was weak but worked. I thought about unpacking, but the fatigue from the trip weighed on me, so I just pulled back the covers and lay down. The first night was restless. I kept waking up to strange noises, floorboards creaking, the faint sound of something scraping against wood. I told myself it was just the old house settling, but the more I listened, the more it felt like the noises were coming from inside the walls or under the floor. I got up a few times to check, walking quietly through the dark house. Nothing seemed out of place. The next day, I decided to explore outside. The town was about 20 minutes away by car, so I drove there for supplies and a bite to eat. People were friendly but kept glancing at me oddly, as if they were watching someone who didn't belong. When I asked about the house I was staying in, some hesitated before changing the subject. That unsettled me more than anything else. Back at the house, I tried to settle into a routine. I cooked simple meals, read books, and took short walks in the woods behind the property. But every evening, just as the sun dipped low, the same noises started again. The scraping, the low thumps, like something was moving inside the walls. I checked the rooms thoroughly, but the walls were solid, and there were no signs of pests or animals. The attic was locked, and the landlord hadn't given me a key, saying it was off limits for safety reasons. One night, I woke to a sudden, loud bang from upstairs, like something heavy falling. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just an old house reacting to the cold night air. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I went outside and looked for clues. The yard was overgrown, and near the back porch, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud, too large to be mine. They led towards the forest but stopped abruptly. I hadn't seen anyone else around since I arrived. That same day, while cleaning the living room, I found an old envelope wedged between the floorboards near the fireplace. Inside were several folded letters, all yellowed with age. The handwriting was hurried and shaky. The letters talked about strange noises, locked doors, and someone watching from the shadows. The writer warned a friend not to trust the landlord and mentioned that previous guests had left abruptly, terrified but refusing to say why. My stomach tightened. I wanted to leave immediately, but my car had a flat tire from something sharp on the driveway I hadn't noticed before. I was stuck until I could fix it or get help. The isolation suddenly felt suffocating. That night, the noises became unbearable. Scratches rang out sharply against the wooden walls, followed by a slow, dragging sound moving from the attic down the stairs. My bedroom door creaked open on its own, and I froze, clutching the blanket. The air turned cold and thick with the smell of rust and old wood. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, preparing to investigate. I crept toward the stairs, every step making my heart pound harder. As I reached the bottom, the dragging sound stopped. I checked the hallway, then the living room, but there was nothing. Only the heavy silence pressing in on me. I felt a wave of relief, but also a creeping suspicion. I tried to shake it off and headed back to bed, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The next morning, I decided to pack and leave no matter what. The flat tire was still there, but I found an old bicycle in the garage. I took it, hoping to reach the town and call for a tow. As I locked up, I noticed the landlord's truck parked a short distance away, engine running but no one visible. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, realizing the landlord might be watching me. I rode the bike quickly down the road, the forest looming on either side. At the town's gas station, I called roadside assistance and booked a motel room. I told them I couldn't stay at the Airbnb any longer. That night, back at the motel, I barely slept. I kept replaying the strange events, the noises, the letters, the landlord's silent presence. I researched the house's history online and found out it had been owned by the same family for decades, with rumors of mysterious disappearances and guests who never came back. Nothing official, just whispers buried in old forum posts. Days later, a tow truck fixed my car, and I drove away from that place without looking back. I never told anyone the full story. It wasn't about ghosts or curses, but the heavy feeling of being trapped, watched, and silenced in a place where someone had clearly kept secrets too dark to share. The house was real, the fear was real, and the danger was very much alive in the quiet spaces where no one looked too closely. I never stayed in an Airbnb again. I booked the Airbnb on a whim, needing a break from the city. It was a small cottage tucked away in a quiet part of Vermont, about an hour from the nearest town. The photos showed a charming, rustic place with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and big windows looking out onto dense woods. The price was decent, and the host seemed friendly enough in their messages, so I decided to go for it. It was early spring 2019, and I thought the fresh air and silence would be just what I needed. I arrived just before sunset, carrying my bags through the narrow gravel driveway lined with thick trees. The cottage looked exactly like the pictures, old but well kept, with flower boxes on the windows and a small porch. The air smelled faintly of pine and earth, and the quiet felt heavy in a good way. No cars, no city noise, just nature. I locked the car behind me and stepped onto the porch, pushing open the wooden door that creaked softly. Inside, the place was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke. There was a stack of firewood near the fireplace and a small kitchen with old-fashioned but clean appliances. I dropped my bags and walked to the windows, watching the sun dip lower behind the trees. The sky was turning pink and purple, and the woods around the house looked dark and dense, almost swallowing the fading light. I set about unpacking, lighting the fire in the hearth to take the chill off the room. The house was quiet except for the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. It was the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound, the tapping of a branch against a window, the rustle of leaves outside. As the evening settled in, I prepared a simple dinner and ate by the fireplace. Outside, the darkness deepened quickly. I didn't have cell service inside the house, but I thought that was part of the charm. After dinner, I settled into the couch with a book, but the firelight flickered strangely, casting odd shadows on the walls. I tried to shake the feeling that something was off, but told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Around 9 p.m., I decided to check the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. Everything seemed fine. The front door had a sturdy old lock, and the windows were latched tight. That's when I noticed it. Faint sounds outside, like footsteps crunching on gravel. The driveway was maybe 30 feet from the porch, but no car was there. The sound was slow and deliberate. I froze and listened harder, but it stopped. I thought maybe it was an animal, deer or something, but the slow, heavy steps didn't fit. I told myself it was nothing and went back inside. I pulled the curtains closed but left a small gap to see outside. The moon had come out, pale and cold. The woods looked even darker. Then I noticed something else, a faint light like a small flashlight or a phone screen, flickering far in the trees. It was just beyond the edge of the clearing the house sat in. It moved slowly, like someone walking through the brush. I didn't recognize the path or any trail near the house that would explain someone wandering there at this hour. My heart started beating faster. I debated calling the host, but without cell signal, there was no way to make a call or even send a message. The house had a landline, but I hadn't checked if it worked yet. I decided to go check it. The phone was on a small table near the kitchen. I picked it up and heard a dial tone, which surprised me. I tried calling the host's number, but it just rang and went to voicemail. I left a message trying to keep my voice steady. Then, I tried the local emergency number just in case, but the line was dead. I hung up, feeling more isolated than ever. Back at the window, the light in the woods had disappeared. I tried to convince myself it was someone lost or maybe a hunter, but it didn't explain the slow footsteps on the gravel earlier. I decided to lock every door and window again, double-checking them. The house was old, and some of the locks were rusty, but they seemed secure enough. I turned off most of the lights and sat back near the fireplace. I wanted to stay calm, so I wrapped myself in a blanket and kept the fire going. I tried to focus on the book, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. Every now and then, I thought I heard something. A twig snapping, the soft crunch of leaves, the faintest movement beyond the glass. But when I looked, there was nothing. The night felt endless. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. At one point, I heard a low thud against the back of the house. Not loud, but definite. Something had hit the siding. My stomach twisted. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly crept to the back door. The light barely cut through the dark, but I scanned the area. No footprints, no signs of a person. Just the trees standing still, the wind barely moving. The thud didn't repeat, and there was no clear sign of anything out there. I considered going to a neighbor's house, but the closest one was miles away, and I didn't know the area well. I locked the back door and returned inside. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. The rest of the night passed with the occasional creak or rustle. Nothing clear enough to tell what was outside. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved to see the first light filtering through the windows. I decided to pack up and leave as soon as possible. After breakfast, I double-checked everything one last time, then walked to my car. The gravel driveway looked empty and still, but the uneasy feeling lingered. As I pulled out onto the road, I glanced back at the house one last time. Later, back in town and with my phone working again, I tried to contact the host. No answer. I searched online and found out the property had been listed for a few months under different names. There were several complaints about strange noises and people feeling watched, but nothing official. No reports of break-ins or police visits. The worst part was when I checked the house's security camera footage. The host had installed a camera on the porch, apparently to monitor the property remotely. I found the video on a public site by mistake. The footage showed someone walking up the driveway late at night. The person was wearing dark clothes and moved quietly, circling the house multiple times but never approaching the door directly. At one point, the figure stopped and appeared to look into a window, then disappeared into the woods. The camera recorded nothing else until morning. That explained the footsteps, the light in the woods, and the thud on the back. Someone had been watching the house, waiting, but never making themselves obvious enough to be caught or scared off. They didn't break in or try to steal anything. They just stayed out there, lurking. I reported it to the police, who told me it was likely a local trespasser or someone obsessed with the property. Without more evidence or a clear suspect, they couldn't do much. The host eventually took down the listing. I haven't gone back to that part of Vermont since. The quiet there is different now, like something invisible is still out in those woods, waiting. The real fear wasn't ghosts or stories. It was knowing someone had been close enough to watch every move I made, without me ever seeing them. And that kind of silence is the worst kind of scary. That experience changed how I think about renting places online. Now, I always check the reviews carefully, call the host, and trust my gut if something feels off. Because sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what you see or hear. It's what's just outside your window, hiding in the dark. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. It was a small cabin on the edge of a dense forest, about an hour's drive from a quiet town in Oregon. The year was 2019, and I was 28. I wanted a break from the city noise, the crowded streets, and endless distractions. The listing showed a charming place. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and large windows overlooking the trees. The price was reasonable and the reviews were mostly good. I figured it would be perfect for a weekend alone. Some peace, and maybe a bit of hiking. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The GPS took me down narrow dirt roads that twisted and turned through thick woods. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the tall pines. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Small but sturdy, with a front porch and a rusty old swing hanging by chains. The door was locked with a keypad. The host had texted me the code earlier, so I punched it in and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine and old wood. There was a living room with a couch, a small kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. The windows showed nothing but trees in every direction. I set my bags down, flicked on the lights, and took a deep breath. This was exactly what I needed. The first night was quiet but not peaceful. The forest outside made strange noises, the crackling of branches, the rustle of leaves, and something deeper, like heavy footsteps, though I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. I lay awake in the dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my phone screen. The next morning, I woke to an odd silence. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I tried to ignore it and went for a walk on a trail that started behind the cabin. The path was overgrown, but I pushed through, curious to see what was at the end. After about a mile, I reached a small clearing with an old wooden bench. It looked abandoned, worn by time and weather. I sat down for a moment, feeling like someone had been watching me. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement, which I hadn't seen before, was now in the corner of the living room. It was a heavy wooden door with iron hinges and a padlock. I was sure it hadn't been there when I arrived. My heart quickened, but curiosity won over. I looked around and found a key taped under the kitchen sink. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door. The basement was dark and musty. I switched on my flashlight and saw old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked in the corners, and walls lined with shelves holding jars filled with strange, dried plants. There were notes pinned to the wall, scribbled with strange symbols and words I couldn't understand. The air felt thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I stepped back upstairs, feeling uneasy. I wanted to leave, but the thought of the long drive back and the remoteness of the place made me hesitate. I told myself it was probably just an old storage room the owner forgot to mention. That evening, as darkness fell, the noises outside grew louder and closer. I could hear scraping against the cabin walls, something heavy being dragged along the ground. I checked the locks on the doors and windows twice. My phone barely had signal and the battery was low. I felt trapped. At some point, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I froze, staring at the window, trying to see through the thick darkness. There was nothing but shadows and the faint outline of trees. The footsteps stopped. Then, a soft thud against the window pane. I yanked the curtains shut and backed away. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat by the fireplace, clutching a heavy lamp I found in a drawer. I thought about calling for help, but there was no signal, and no one knew I was here. I regretted coming. I thought about the reviews that mentioned quirky charm and quiet solitude, but none mentioned this feeling of being watched or the strange noises that echoed through the night. Around 3 a.m., I heard the basement door creak open. Slowly, I held my breath, waiting. The sound of footsteps descending the stairs echoed faintly. The heavy scraping and dragging noise returned, louder now, closer to the front door. I realized then that the cabin wasn't just abandoned or forgotten. It was being used, maybe recently. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and prepared to leave, but the front door wouldn't open. It was locked from the outside. Panic set in. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but only the silence answered back. The lights flickered, then went out. I was left in darkness, cold and alone. I remembered the basement key and ran down the stairs, hoping to find another way out. The basement was pitch black, and my flashlight's beam bounced off the walls in jerky movements. At the far end, I spotted a window, dirty and cracked, but maybe big enough to climb through. I forced the window open and squeezed myself through the narrow gap. Outside, the cold night air hit me hard. I stumbled into the woods and ran, not knowing where I was going, just desperate to get away. The sounds followed, branches snapping, heavy breathing. I didn't look back. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a dirt road. My phone flickered to life for a moment and showed a signal bar. I called the local police and told them everything I could. The police came the next day with search dogs. They found the cabin empty and locked up again. No sign of anyone living there. But in the basement, they discovered evidence of someone having stayed recently. Old food wrappers, a makeshift bed, and a journal filled with ramblings about watching the watchers and waiting for the right time. The host never responded to my messages again, and the Airbnb listing was removed shortly after. I never found out who was in that cabin or what they wanted, but I learned that some places, no matter how cozy or inviting they look online, can hide things you don't want to find. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't about ghosts or monsters, but about real people and real dangers lurking just out of sight, waiting for you to walk through the door. The summer of 2019 felt like the perfect time to get away from the constant noise of the city. I'd been working long hours and needed a break, some peace and quiet. So, I booked an Airbnb in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina. It was a charming old farmhouse, just outside the edge of a dense forest, far enough from the main road to feel isolated, but close enough for supplies. The photos showed a cozy, rustic place with wooden floors, big windows, and a fireplace. It looked perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, driving down a narrow dirt road surrounded by tall trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The house sat at the end of a clearing, looking weathered but sturdy. The porch had a few chairs, peeling paint, and a welcome mat that was so faded I could barely read the word hello. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The inside was dim but clean. The smell of old wood and a faint trace of something like mildew filled the air. There was a thick layer of dust on the windowsills, and a few cobwebs hung in corners, but it wasn't bad for a house that looked like it hadn't been lived in much lately. I unpacked, set up my laptop on the dining table, and lit a fire in the fireplace before the sun went down. The warmth made the room feel less empty. That first night, I barely slept. The silence was heavy. No distant traffic, no neighbors, just the occasional creak of the old house settling. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound outside. A slow, scraping noise, like something was dragging along the side of the house. I sat up, heart pounding, but the windows were shut tight. I told myself it was probably a branch hitting the siding or a raccoon looking for food. I tried to relax and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I noticed the back door's paint was chipped in a way I hadn't seen before. It looked like something sharp had scratched it, running vertically along the edge. I thought maybe the scraping sound was a branch scraping the door, but there were no big trees close enough to reach it. I took photos and made a mental note to tell the host when I got back. During the day, I explored the area. The forest was thick and full of twisted trees, some fallen and rotting. I found a narrow path leading deeper into the woods but decided not to follow it far. The air was cool and damp under the thick canopy, and shadows moved oddly. It gave me the creeps, so I went back to the house. That night was worse. I heard footsteps outside again, but this time they circled the house. It wasn't like an animal moving randomly. These were slow, deliberate steps, pacing around the building's perimeter. I stayed awake for hours, watching through the curtains, but saw nothing. The porch light was off, and the moon was hidden behind clouds, so it was pitch dark outside. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was a person walking by or a stray dog. But why would someone circle a house in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m.? I locked all the doors and windows and tried to keep calm. On the third day, I found something on the porch. A small, rough bundle wrapped in an old rag, tied with twine. I hesitated but unwrapped it. Inside was a pile of sticks, sharpened at the ends, and some dried leaves. I had no idea what it was supposed to mean. Maybe some kind of old folk ritual? It looked deliberately placed right by the door. I called the Airbnb host from a coffee shop in town and explained everything. The noises, the marks on the door, the strange bundle. The host sounded uneasy but said they hadn't heard about any problems before and that the house was in a quiet area. They suggested it might be kids playing pranks or local hunters leaving marks. I thanked them but felt less reassured. That evening, I stayed inside the whole time, double-checking the locks and windows. Around 10 p.m., I heard the slow scraping noise again, this time closer to the front porch. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. The light barely reached past the steps, but I saw a shadow dart behind a tree at the edge of the clearing. My pulse spiked. I sat down and waited. After a long silence, I decided to check the porch. Everything looked normal except the small bundle was gone. I didn't know if someone had taken it or if it was just moved by the wind, but I felt like I couldn't stay calm anymore. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. Around 4 a.m., the power went out. The whole house plunged into darkness. I reached for my phone, but the battery was low, and the weak flashlight app flickered before dying. The fireplace was cold, and the silence was complete. I didn't want to go outside, but I needed to find candles or matches. I felt my way along the walls, trying to avoid tripping over furniture. Then I heard it, the slow, steady footsteps again, right outside the front door. This time they stopped. For what felt like forever, no movement, no sound. Then a faint scraping like nails on wood. I pressed my body against the door, heart racing. I thought about screaming, running, calling for help, but I had no signal. The house was too far from neighbors to hear me. I stayed still, waiting for whatever was there to leave. After a long time, the noises stopped. I waited another hour before trying the lights again. The power came back on, and relief washed over me. The next morning, I packed everything in a hurry. I didn't want to stay another second. Outside, I found footprints in the dirt around the house, too big and too many to be an animal. Someone had been watching the place, moving around the house at night. I left without even telling the host in detail. The whole trip was ruined, and I felt shaken for weeks. Looking back, the house wasn't haunted or cursed, but someone had clearly been lurking nearby, probably for weeks or months. It wasn't a story of ghosts or strange creatures, just a real threat of a person who wanted to scare, or maybe worse. I never stayed in an isolated Airbnb again. That summer, what should have been a relaxing break became a terrifying reminder that sometimes the scariest things are just human. I booked the Airbnb on a quiet Friday afternoon in late October. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, a change of scenery, and some peace away from the city noise. The listing was for a small, isolated house in a rural area outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The photos looked charming, if a bit rustic. A one-story cabin-style home surrounded by dense woods, with a wraparound porch and a small garden. The price was right, and I needed a break from work. What could go wrong? I arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the tall trees. The gravel driveway led up to the house, and the place looked exactly as in the pictures. The air was cool and smelled like pine and damp earth. I unlocked the door with the keypad code the host had texted me earlier. The door creaked open to reveal a cozy interior with worn wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and simple furniture. The place had a lived-in feel, like it hadn't been touched much in recent years but was clean enough. I dropped my bags and decided to explore before night fully settled in. The backyard was small but opened into thick woods. I noticed a narrow dirt path disappearing into the trees about 50 feet from the house. I was curious but didn't go far. The fading light was already making the forest seem darker and more foreboding. Inside, I found the old radio on a shelf, a relic from another time. It was dusty but plugged in, so I turned it on. Static crackled until a faint country music station came through. It added a strange feeling to the silence around me. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room. I unpacked a few things and made a quick dinner from the groceries I'd brought. As night fell, the house seemed to shrink. The shadows cast by the porch light stretched long across the yard, and the woods felt like they were pressing closer. I sat in the living room with a flashlight, reading an old book I found on the coffee table. Suddenly, I heard a noise, soft but definite. It sounded like footsteps outside, slow and deliberate on the gravel driveway. I stopped reading and listened. The footsteps stopped too. Silence stretched for a long moment before I heard a faint rustling near the back door. I had no cell signal here, no way to call for help if something was wrong. My heart began to race. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly approached the back door, peering out the small window. Nothing. No sign of anyone. The woods were still, only the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot far away. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was an animal or the wind moving branches. I locked all the doors and windows again, checked the kitchen knives for peace of mind, and sat back down. The radio flickered, cutting off the music and shifting to static again. Then, just as suddenly, it went silent. Hours passed. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig outside, but no pattern or explanation. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a loud bang on the front door. It was heavy, like someone had slammed their fist against it. I froze. The house was pitch black except for the moonlight filtering through the curtains. The banging came again, rhythmic now, 3 times, then a pause, then 3 more. Felt deliberate, like a signal. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening to the night sounds outside. After what felt like forever, the banging stopped. The silence returned, but now it felt thick, almost suffocating. I tried to convince myself it was just a drunk person passing by or some prankster, but I knew the house was miles from any main road. The next morning, I didn't sleep much. I left the house before sunrise and drove into town to find a cafe. I tried calling the host several times but got no response. I emailed Airbnb support and reported what happened. They promised to look into it, but no one ever followed up. When I returned later that day, I found something strange. On the porch, scratched into the wood near the front step, were 3 sets of initials, each carved deep and old, worn by time but fresh enough to be noticed. I hadn't seen them when I arrived. I photographed them and left immediately. Back in the city, I researched the house's history. It turned out the place had been owned by an older man who disappeared years ago. Neighbors mentioned strange noises and sightings of people walking the grounds late at night. There was no evidence of foul play, but the house was considered unsettled. I never stayed there again. Even though nothing supernatural happened, the experience was terrifying because it was real. The isolation, the unexplained noises, the feeling of being watched, the mysterious banging. All things that could happen anywhere but hit harder when you're completely alone. I still get chills thinking about that weekend. The lesson I learned is simple. Some places hold onto the past in ways you can't see or explain. Sometimes, the real horror is knowing you were not as alone as you thought, even when there was no one to talk to. No ghost story to tell, just silence and the dark pressing in from all sides. I rented the Airbnb on the edge of a small town in Oregon. It was early spring of 2022, and I was looking for a quiet place to get away from my noisy city life. The listing showed a cozy old house with lots of character. Wooden floors, big windows, and a garden with wildflowers. The photos looked inviting, and the price was reasonable, so I booked it for a week. When I arrived, the sun was setting, casting a golden light on the house. The neighborhood was silent except for a few distant cars. The house was isolated, sitting on a street with only a handful of other houses spaced far apart. The front door was a little worn, but it opened easily with the key code the owner had sent me. Inside, the air smelled faintly musty, like the house hadn't been aired out in a while. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I explored. The place had a weird charm, but I noticed some things were off. The kitchen had old appliances, and there were random tools scattered on a table. The living room had a worn-out couch, and the TV didn't seem to work. Upstairs, the bedroom was small but clean enough. The bed was lumpy, but the blankets smelled fresh. I told myself I could deal with these minor flaws since I was only staying for a few days. That first night, I barely slept. The house was so quiet it almost felt unnatural. Every small noise, the wind tapping the windows, the settling of the wooden frame, felt amplified in the silence. At one point, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the hallway outside my room. I froze, listening closely, but they stopped. I convinced myself it was just the old house creaking or maybe a small animal outside. The next day, I spent most of my time walking around the town and hiking nearby trails. When I came back in the evening, the house felt even stranger. The lights flickered briefly as I turned them on, and the heater made a rattling noise that set my nerves on edge. I started noticing little details that I had missed before. The locks on the doors seemed flimsy and old, with scratches around the edges. The windows weren't properly sealed, and I could feel cold drafts even though the heater was on. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. They paced slowly down the hallway, stopping just outside my bedroom door. I lay still, heart pounding, but there was no knocking or anything else. Just the sound of shoes on wood walking away. I wanted to tell myself it was the previous guest or the owner checking on the place, but the house didn't have a policy for late-night visits. The next morning, I tried to find the contact info of the owner in the welcome booklet, but the phone number was disconnected. The email bounced back. I started searching online for any information about the house or its past renters, but there was almost nothing. No reviews mentioning anything strange, just the usual compliments about the peaceful location. During the day, I checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked tight. I found one window in the basement that wasn't latched properly. When I pushed it, it opened a few inches. It looked like someone could have used it to get in. That made my skin crawl. That night, I didn't want to stay in the house, but I didn't have many options. The nearest hotel was miles away, and I had no car. I tried sleeping with the bedroom door locked and a chair pushed against it. Around midnight, the footsteps started again. This time, they were upstairs, right above me. I could hear someone pacing back and forth on the floorboards. I gathered enough courage to get up and check, but the hallway was empty. The air was cold and smelled faintly of something like wet dirt and metal. I felt a chill run down my spine. I went downstairs to look around the house, flashlight in hand. The basement door was slightly open, though I was sure I had closed it. The basement was dark and smelled damp. I scanned the room with the flashlight and noticed something that made me stop cold. Fresh muddy footprints on the concrete floor. They led to a small door in the corner I hadn't seen before. It was almost hidden behind old boxes and covered in dust, but the footprints went right up to it. I tried the door, and it creaked open slowly. Inside, there was a narrow crawl space. I shone my light inside and saw a few discarded items. An old pair of sneakers, some torn clothes, and a flashlight with dead batteries. It looked like someone had been hiding there. Fear hit me hard. Someone had been living in the house without me knowing. Someone had access to the basement, could move around the house, and maybe had been the source of the footsteps I heard every night. I went back upstairs as fast as I could, locked every door, and barricaded myself in my room again. I decided I wouldn't stay another night. I packed my things quietly and left the house at dawn, feeling the eyes of an invisible presence watching me leave. As I drove away, I called the local police and told them everything. They came to check the house with me a few days later. When they opened the hidden door in the basement, they found clear signs someone had been living there illegally for weeks, maybe months. The footprints, the food wrappers, and even some personal belongings left behind. They told me the owner was unaware of this and that sometimes squatting happened in these old, isolated houses. I learned later that the house had been empty for a long time before it was listed on Airbnb. The owner had only recently started renting it out online without checking it thoroughly. The man living in the basement was arrested, and the house was cleaned and secured. That experience left me shaken. It made me realize how dangerous it can be to rent a place without knowing its full history. The house looked innocent enough, but the cracks beneath the surface were real. The quiet neighborhood wasn't peaceful after all. It was hiding something darker and more real than any story about ghosts. Since then, I've been much more careful about where I stay. I check reviews, ask for verified photos, and never ignore those little uneasy feelings. That week in Oregon reminded me that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see. The people who hide in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. It was late October 2023 when I booked a small Airbnb cabin in the mountains of North Carolina for a weekend getaway. I had been working nonstop for months and needed a break from city life. The listing looked perfect, remote, cozy, surrounded by trees and quiet. The host had good reviews, so I didn't hesitate. I arrived just before sunset, the sky a deep orange with dark clouds rolling in. The cabin was older than the pictures suggested, but charming in its own way. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, with a narrow dirt driveway leading up to it. The porch had a creaky swing, and the smell of old wood mixed with pine filled the air. I pulled my bags inside and flipped on the lights. The electricity worked fine, and the heat kicked on almost immediately. I felt a little relief knowing I wouldn't freeze overnight. Inside, the cabin had one main room with a small kitchen, a living area, and a loft bedroom above. The furniture was simple: worn couch, a wooden table, some mismatched chairs. The kitchen had the basics: a small stove, fridge, microwave, and some dusty dishes in the cupboards. The bathroom was tiny but functional, with a small shower that worked fine. I unpacked my things and decided to make some dinner. The storm outside was growing louder now, with heavy wind and rain starting to tap against the windows. I cooked a simple pasta meal and ate at the table while watching the rain streak down the glass. The only sounds were the storm and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. After eating, I decided to check my phone, but the signal was weak. The Wi-Fi was barely working, making it hard to do much online. I tried to ignore it. That was kind of the point, to disconnect for a while. I lit a few candles and settled in on the couch with a book. But the wind howled more, making the windows rattle and the trees groan outside. Around 10 p.m., I started feeling uneasy. The cabin's silence felt heavy, like the air itself was thicker. I told myself it was just the storm and the isolation. But then I noticed something odd. Every few minutes, there was a faint tapping sound coming from the front door area. At first, I thought it was rain or wind hitting the porch, but the pattern was too deliberate, like a light knock. I got up and walked to the door, peeking through the window. Nothing was there. The porch was empty, soaked with rain. No footprints or signs of anyone being outside. I shook it off and closed the curtains tightly. Maybe it was just a branch hitting the door frame. I went back to the couch, but the feeling didn't go away. Then the power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The cabin plunged into darkness except for my candles flickering on the table. My heart rate sped up a bit, but I told myself the storm probably knocked the lines out. I grabbed my phone for light, but it was nearly dead. I decided to check the breaker box in the small storage closet. The air felt colder, and the silence was thick except for the storm's roar. I found the box and flipped the switches. When the lights didn't come back on, I felt a growing unease. I didn't want to sit in the dark all night, especially somewhere so isolated. Back in the living room, I noticed something else. On the floor near the door, there was a wet footprint. It looked fresh and wasn't mine. I knew I had locked the door. I moved carefully to check outside the window again. The rain was still coming down hard, but no one was on the porch. Then I heard it again, a faint tapping, but this time coming from the back window near the kitchen. I slowly walked over, shining my phone's weak light. The window was closed, but there was a small dent in the glass and scratches around the frame. Whoever was outside had tried to get in. Panic began to rise. I grabbed the small kitchen knife from the drawer and held it tightly. I checked all the doors and windows. They were locked, but the signs were clear. Someone had been here recently, maybe still was. The storm outside made it hard to hear anything else, but I felt trapped. I tried calling 911, but my phone showed no service. I was alone, powerless, and without any way to call for help. The storm was raging, the power out, and some unknown person had been trying to enter the cabin. Minutes passed like hours. I stayed near the front door, watching the windows. The tapping stopped, but the footsteps outside never fully faded. Occasionally, I could hear rustling in the bushes or the scraping of branches. The wind pushed the rain against the cabin in sheets, making it impossible to see clearly outside. Around midnight, the power suddenly snapped back on. The lights flickered but stayed on. I exhaled sharply, hoping that maybe the storm had passed or at least the worst was over. I immediately texted a friend with the address and explained the situation, asking them to call local authorities if they didn't hear from me soon. Then I noticed something else. Inside the cabin, on the kitchen counter, was a small pile of wet leaves and twigs. I was sure I hadn't brought them in, and the only way they could have gotten there was if someone had entered while I was distracted. I locked myself in the loft bedroom grabbed my phone and knife and waited. The hours crawled by. No more noises, no more tapping. When morning came, I carefully opened the door and checked every room. The leaves and twigs were gone. The windows and doors were all still locked. I left immediately, driving back to the nearest town. The police told me that break-ins and robberies had been reported in the area before, especially in isolated cabins like this one. They said the perpetrator probably waited out the storm, hoping I would be vulnerable. In the end, the experience was a harsh reminder of how dangerous isolation can be, especially when someone with bad intentions is nearby. I realized how lucky I was to escape without harm. That weekend getaway turned into a nightmare I still remember clearly, and I never stayed at a remote Airbnb again without checking the area's safety thoroughly first. That cabin wasn't haunted or cursed, just a place where someone had tried to take advantage of a lone traveler in a storm. The fear wasn't about ghosts, but real danger lurking quietly outside the door, waiting for the right moment to strike.